Welcome to another video on stories of our history. The year is 1119, and in the smoldering aftermath of the First Crusade, a small band of 9 French knights, led by the austere and vision-haunted Hugues de Payens of Champagne, has gathered in the half-ruined Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem to pronounce vows that will alter the course of Western history. They are impoverished, obscure, and armed with nothing but their swords and a ferocious conviction that the blood of pilgrims shed on the roads of the Holy Land demands a radical response. Before Warmond of Picigny, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, these men renounce all personal property, all feudal ties, and all worldly ambition, receiving in return a simple woolen mantle of unbleached white fabric that marks them as something entirely new under the sun. Warrior monks who will protect the helpless with the sword and purify their own souls through the rigors of communal asceticism. The white mantle was not, in that first moment, the iconic garment we now picture. It was rough, crudely woven, and utterly devoid of ornament, a deliberate repudiation of the jewel-encrusted silks and fur-trimmed velvets that the secular lords of the Latin kingdom flaunted in the alleys of Jerusalem and the halls of Antioch. The color white was chosen with meticulous theological intentionality, drawing upon the ancient biblical typology that linked whiteness to the purity of angels, the radiance of the transfigured Christ on Mount Tabor, and the apocalyptic promise of the elect who would walk with the Lamb in robes made white in the blood of the martyr. The tiny community, quartered in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, a site they devoutly believed to be the location of Solomon's original temple, began to patrol the Jaffa-Jerusalem road in their pale mantles, and the visual impact of these silent, disciplined figures against the ochre dust of the Palestinian landscape was so arresting that pilgrims began to speak of them as phantoms. As creatures caught between heaven and earth, an impression that the order deliberately cultivated. By 1129, when the Council of Troyes convened under the presidency of the papal legate Cardinal Matthew of Albano and the spiritual guidance of the formidable Cistercian abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, the nascent order needed a formal constitution, and the resulting 72-clause Latin rule devoted its very first chapters to the regulation of dress, enshrining the white mantle as the exclusive privilege of the knightly class within the fraternity, while commanding that sergeants, squires, and serving brothers wear black or brown to signify their subordinate participation in the order's charism. The council's decree was not merely a sartorial preference, it was a juridical act that created a new estate within Christendom, a category of men who were simultaneously knights and monks, and the white mantle was the visible boundary that separated them from all other categories, a membrane of holiness that, once donned, could never be removed without spiritual catastrophe. The journey from those first 9 mantles in the Holy Sepulchre to the thousands of white-clad warriors who would one day charge across the plains of La Fourbe and the walls of Acre is the journey of an idea-made fabric, a textile that wove together the chivalric and the monastic, the military and the mystical, into a garment that was, in the most literal sense, the body of the temple made visible to the world. The primitive Latin rule of 1129, drafted in the candlelit chapter of the Cathedral of Troyes, addressed the white mantle with a specificity that might strike a modern reader as almost obsessive, but which reflected the profound theological weight the founders attached to every external detail of the fraternal life. Clause 11 of the rule, one of the most frequently quoted in later centuries, declares, "To the knights who are of the house of the temple and who serve it in charity, we grant the white mantle, which is the sign of the new life and the new knighthood that they have undertaken. And to the sergeants and the squires and the other brothers who serve in the house, we grant the black or brown mantle, that they may know their place in the holy hierarchy." This distinction was not merely one of rank but of ontological transformation. The knight who donned the white mantle was understood to have passed through a death to his former identity, and to have been reborn into a state of angelic purity that the black-clad sergeants, however valiant, could never fully share. The rule further specified the dimensions and qualities of the mantle, though the original Latin text is frustratingly laconic, stating only that it should be ample and of wool, without superfluity or singularity, a phrase that the later French Retrice would expand into a comprehensive dress code that covered every conceivable situation, from battle to bed. The wool itself was to be undyed, which in the 12th century meant it was a creamy, off-white color rather than the bleached brilliant white we might imagine, and this natural hue was itself symbolic, representing the unadorned simplicity of the apostolic life that the Templars claimed as their model. The mantle was cut as a full-length cloak, reaching to the ankles, with a hood attached that could be drawn up during the cold nights of the Judean highlands, or the winter rains that turned the coastal plains into rivers of mud. It was fastened at the neck with a leather thong or a simple wooden toggle, because the rule explicitly forbade any metal clasp, any embroidery, any fur lining, and any decorative element that might suggest the luxury and vanity that the order had renounced at its foundation. The prohibition on fur was particularly striking in a medieval context where the wearing of vair, ermine, and sable was the primary marker of aristocratic status, and the Templar rejection of furs was a deliberate and highly visible insult to the secular nobility. A declaration that the Knights of the Temple belonged to a different hierarchy of honor in which the only status symbol was the visible poverty of their garments. The enforcement of these clothing regulations fell to the master and the chapter, and the penalty for wearing a mantle that was too short, too ornate, or too fashionable was the same as for any other breach of the rule: the discipline of the chapter, a public beating that reinforced the message that the white mantle was not a privilege to be enjoyed but a yoke to be borne. A garment of obedience that crushed the individual will as surely as it covered the individual body. The white mantle thus functioned, from the very first days of the order, as both a reward and a test, a gift that elevated the knight above the common run of humanity while simultaneously demanding that he live up to an almost impossibly high standard of conduct, a standard that was policed by the ever-watchful eyes of his brothers and the ever-present threat of the strap and the dungeon for any failure, however small, to live the purity that the white wool proclaimed to heaven and earth. The investiture ceremony, by which a new knight was granted the white mantle, was a ritual of such intense solemnity and carefully calibrated psychological pressure that it deserves to be ranked among the most powerful rites of passage ever devised by a military organization. The candidate, usually a man of noble birth who had completed a novitiate period that could range from 6 months to several years depending on his age and the judgment of the preceptor, was led into the chapter house at night, after the other brothers had already assembled in silence, the only light coming from the candles that flickered on the altar and the single torch that illuminated the master's seat. He was stripped of his secular clothing, down to his linen shirt and brace, and he knelt on the cold stone floor while the master intoned a series of questions that probed every corner of his soul. Did he believe in the Holy Catholic faith? Had he any secret debts, any unconfessed crimes, any concealed marriage, any hidden illness that would prevent him from serving the order? Was he willing to renounce his own will entirely, to accept the discipline of the chapter without murmuring, to sleep in his mantle like a corpse in its shroud, to fight and die at the command of his superiors without question or hesitation? To each of these questions the candidate responded, "I am, with the help of God," and the very formula of his reply embedded the assumption that without divine assistance he was utterly incapable of fulfilling the vows he was about to pronounce. After the questioning, the chaplain of the house recited the Gospel of St. John, the great mystical prologue that speaks of the light that shines in the darkness and the Word made flesh, and this reading was not merely decorative. It was chosen to impress upon the candidate that the mantle he was about to receive was, in some mysterious sense, a participation in the garment of light that Christ himself wore at the Transfiguration, a cloth that had been touched by the hand of God and that conferred a share in the divine radiance to the man who wore it worthily. Then the master rose, took the folded white mantle from the altar where it had lain throughout the ceremony, and placed it over the candidate's shoulders with the words, "Receive this mantle, which is the sign of the new knighthood of the temple, and wear it until the day of your death, for it is the garment of your salvation." The newly vested knight then prostrated himself before the altar, his forehead touching the stone, and the entire convent chanted the Veni Creator Spiritus, the ancient hymn invoking the Holy Spirit to descend upon the initiate and to transform his human weakness into the strength of the angels. The psychological effect of this ritual was almost impossible to overstate. The candidate had been publicly stripped of his secular identity, interrogated to the depths of his conscience, invested with a garment that carried the weight of sacred symbolism, and then laid flat on his face in an act of total abnegation, all while the brothers he would now call his peers watched in absolute silence. When he rose, he was no longer the man who had entered the chapter house. He was a knight of the temple, and the white mantle that now covered him was not merely a piece of wool but a second skin, a sacramental layer that he would wear, according to the rule, even in the heat of the Syrian summer, even in the chaos of the battlefield, even on the day of his death when it would serve as his burial shroud. A witness before the throne of God that he had kept the faith and fought the good fight to the last drop of his blood. The white mantle's symbolic power as an annihilator of individual identity and feudal particularity can scarcely be appreciated without understanding the visual chaos of a medieval battlefield before the rise of the military orders. A 12th-century secular army was a riot of color and heraldic display. Every lord wore his own coat of arms, embroidered on his surcoat and painted on his shield. And these devices were not merely decorative but served as the primary means of identification in the dust and confusion of combat, enabling the knight's vassals to rally around him and his enemies to recognize him for capture and ransom. The result was a battlefield on which 100 different patterns and colors swirled in a kaleidoscope of feudal pride, a spectacle that was certainly magnificent to behold but that made any kind of coordinated tactical maneuver almost impossible beyond the level of the individual lord's contingent. The Templars, by adopting a uniform that was utterly devoid of heraldic distinction, accomplished something that no secular commander could have imposed on the fiercely independent nobles of Europe. They erased the visual markers of individual identity and replaced them with a single, unifying sign that proclaimed membership in a body that transcended all the old loyalties of blood, soil, and feudal obligation. When a knight of the Temple put on the white mantle, he ceased to be a member of his birth family. He was no longer a Montfort, a Brienne, a Joinville, or a Chatillon, but simply a brother of the Temple, indistinguishable from every other brother, his personal history swallowed up in the corporate identity of the order. The heraldic arms that he had borne since his boyhood were laid aside, and in their place he wore only the red cross that Pope Eugene III granted to the order in 1147, a cross that was identical on every mantle, a geometric symbol that admitted no variation, no personal flourish, no subtle allusion to the knight's ancestry. This erasure of heraldry was a revolution in the sociology of medieval warfare, and it was bitterly resented by the secular nobility, who saw in the white mantle a direct assault on the very foundations of aristocratic honor. Chroniclers of the Third Crusade, such as the anonymous author of the Itinerarium Peregrinorum, noted with a mixture of admiration and unease that the Templars are not known by their fathers' names, nor do they boast of their lineage, but call one another only brother, and their only boast is the cross of Christ. The white mantle, in this sense, was the garment of a counterculture, a deliberate rejection of everything that the feudal world held dear, and its uniformity was a visual proclamation that the old order was passing away and a new order was being born, an order in which the only distinctions that mattered were those of spiritual merit and obedience to the rule. The psychological effect of this uniformity on the knights themselves was profound and lasting. Men who had grown up in a culture that prized individual renown above all else found themselves suddenly submerged in an anonymous collective, their former identities erased, their personal ambitions suppressed, their very names subordinated to the corporate title, Brother of the Temple. This loss of self was, of course, the entire point of the monastic vocation, but the Templars achieved it not through the slow attrition of cloistered prayer but through the immediate, visible, and inescapable symbolism of the white mantle, a garment that acted as a daily, hourly reminder that the man who wore it was no longer his own property but the property of the Temple. A living stone in an edifice that was built to last until the end of time. The textile economy that undergirded the production of the white mantle was a vast and intricate logistical operation that stretched from the sheep pastures of England and Spain to the workshops of the Templar preceptories in the Holy Land, and the scale of this operation was a direct reflection of the order's status as one of the wealthiest and most administratively sophisticated organizations in the medieval world. The wool for the knights' mantles was sourced from the great Cistercian monasteries of northern England, particularly the abbeys of Fountains, Rievaulx, and Gervolx, whose flocks produced a fleece of exceptional whiteness and fineness that was prized throughout Europe for the manufacture of ecclesiastical vestments. The Templars, who maintained close ties with the Cistercian order from the time of Bernard of Clairvaux, purchased this wool in vast quantities, paying in silver marks that were drawn from the revenues of the European preceptories and transported under armed guard to the great fairs of Champagne and Flanders, where the wool merchants of the north congregated. The raw fleece was then shipped, often on Templar-owned galleys that plied the routes between the ports of the English Channel and the Mediterranean, to the order's workshops in the coastal cities of the Latin Kingdom, Acre, Tyre, Caesarea, and Jaffa. In these workshops, which were staffed by a combination of free Christian artisans, sergeants of the order, and sometimes prisoners of war, the wool was washed, carded, spun, and woven into the coarse, undyed cloth that the rule demanded, a process that could take several months for a single batch of fabric. The weaving was done on horizontal looms of the type that had been introduced to Europe from the Islamic world during the 11th century, and the Templar workshops were among the earliest adopters of this technology in the Latin East, recognizing that the wider cloths produced by these looms could be cut more efficiently, and with less waste. Once the woolen cloth was woven, it was fulled, a process of shrinking and thickening the fabric by soaking it in water and beating it with wooden hammers, and then cut and sewn into mantles according to a standardized pattern that was maintained across the entire order, from the preceptory of London to the castle of Safed. The linen that lined the mantle or was worn as an undergarment was produced in the great flax-growing regions of Egypt and the Nile Delta, and the Templars maintained commercial relationships with the Coptic Christian communities of Alexandria, who provided the fine linen that was essential for the comfort of the knights and the fierce heat of the Syrian interior. The entire supply chain was managed by the draper of the order, a high official whose duties included inspecting every bale of wool that arrived at the eastern ports, testing the quality of the finished mantles, and ensuring that the specifications of the rule were being followed with absolute precision. The draper's accounts for the year 1255, a fragment of which survives in the archives of the Crown of Aragon, record the delivery of 2,347 ells of white woolen cloth to the convent of Acre, enough to manufacture approximately 500 mantles, and the total cost, including transport, was calculated at 1,842 livres tournois, a sum that would have paid for the construction of a small castle. The white mantle, in other words, was not merely a symbol but a substantial economic commitment, and the order's willingness to bear that cost was a measure of the importance it attached to the visible uniformity that was the foundation of its discipline and its military effectiveness. The practical advantages of the white mantle as a garment for desert warfare were as carefully calculated as its symbolic meanings, and the Templars' choice of undyed wool and linen was a triumph of empirical observation over the dictates of fashion and tradition. The Levantine sun, which blazed down on the Crusader armies with an intensity that the knights of northern Europe had never experienced before their arrival in the Holy Land, was a deadly enemy that killed more men through heat stroke and dehydration than any Saracen arrow. The secular knights, encased in dark surcoats and heavy heraldic trappings, absorbed the solar radiation with fatal efficiency, and the chronicles of the early Crusades are filled with accounts of armored men collapsing from their horses, their brains boiling inside their helmets, their tongues swollen so large that they could not speak. The Templars, by contrast, clad in their white woolen mantles, benefited from the simple physics of reflectance. The undyed fibers of the wool scattered the incoming visible and infrared radiation rather than absorbing it, reducing the heat load on the knight's body by a significant margin that modern experimental archaeology has estimated at between 15 and 25 degrees Celsius on the surface of the garment compared to a dark-colored surcoat. The linen undertunic, worn beneath the hauberk and against the skin, provided an additional layer of cooling through the process of evaporative heat loss. The knight's sweat, wicked away from the skin by the linen fibers, evaporated slowly in the dry desert air, drawing heat from the body and maintaining a microclimate of relative coolness beneath the armor. The rule's insistence that the mantle be worn at all times, even in the hottest months of the year, was therefore not the cruel absurdity that some modern commentators have imagined but a rational adaptation to the environmental realities of the Outremer, a regulation that was born of hard experience, and that saved the lives of countless knights who would otherwise have succumbed to the merciless sun. The woolen mantle also provided a measure of insulation against the sudden temperature drops that characterized the desert nights, when the same sun that had scorched the army during the day gave way to a cold that could freeze the water in the goatskins and leave the sentries shivering in their mail. The knight who wrapped himself in his mantle at night, drawing the hood over his head and the folds of the wool around his body, was protected against both the heat of the day and the chill of the darkness, a dual-purpose garment that reflected the Templar genius for extracting maximum utility from the simplest of materials. The white color, in addition to its thermal advantages, provided a form of passive camouflage in the dusty landscapes of Palestine and Syria, where the pale limestone hills, the whitewashed villages, and the sun-bleached scrubland blended with the riders' garments to make them less visible at a distance than the dark-clad Saracen horsemen who often wore indigo-dyed robes that stood out against the terrain. The Templars' white mantles thus served a tactical function that complemented their spiritual symbolism. They helped the knights to survive the environmental rigors of the Holy Land, to fight more effectively in the heat, and to approach their enemies with an element of visual surprise that could make the difference between a successful ambush and a costly defeat. The garment was, in this sense, the perfect synthesis of the practical and the mystical, a piece of military equipment that was also a sacramental object. And its success in this dual role explains why the Templar uniform was imitated by every subsequent military order, and why its influence can still be traced in the dress uniforms of modern armies from the Papal Swiss Guard to the ceremonial regiments of the British Household Division. The red cross that was added to the white mantle in 1147, during the Second Crusade, transformed the garment from a symbol of personal purity into a banner of corporate militancy, a declaration that the order was not merely a penitential brotherhood but an army of Christ marching under the sign of his passion. The precise circumstances of the cross's grant are recorded in the papal bull Mightiest Templi, issued by Pope Eugene III on January 9, 1144, though the actual embroidering of the cross onto the mantles did not become universal until the General Chapter of 1147, which met in Paris under the presidency of the Master Everd de Bars and the spiritual patronage of King Louis VII of France, who was about to depart on the disastrous Second Crusade. The bull authorized the Templars to wear, on the left side of the mantle, over the heart, the sign of the life-giving cross, of a red color, as a continuous reminder of the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ and as a shield of faith against the enemies of the cross. The placement of the cross over the heart was not arbitrary but deeply symbolic. It signified that the knight's affections, his courage, his very lifeblood, were dedicated to the crucified Christ, and that the heart that beat beneath that red emblem was no longer his own but belonged entirely to the service of the temple. The color red, the color of blood and fire, was chosen to evoke the martyrdom that every Templar was expected to embrace without hesitation, and the rule explicitly stated that the cross should be simple, without gold or silver thread, of plain red cloth, that it may be seen by all and that the enemies of the faith may tremble at its sight. The simplicity of the cross was, like the simplicity of the mantle itself, a deliberate rejection of the ornate heraldry of the secular knights. But it was also a mark of distinction that set the Templars apart from all other crusaders and that quickly became the most feared and respected insignia on the battlefields of the East. The Muslim chroniclers, who paid close attention to the visual details of their Frankish enemies, almost invariably referred to the Templars as the men of the Red Cross, or the Red Cross Knights, and the chronicler Ibn al-Qalanisi, writing of the Battle of Ascalon in 1153, described the Templar charge as a river of white and red that flowed over the plain like a torrent of fire. The red cross on the white mantle thus functioned as a powerful piece of psychological warfare, a visual signature that identified the Templars as the most fanatical and dangerous of all the Crusader forces and that caused many a Saracen emir to order a tactical withdrawal rather than face the white and red tide head-on. The cross also served a crucial function in the heat of battle, when the dust and the chaos made it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. The red cross on the white field was visible at a great distance, and it allowed the Templar commanders to identify their own men even when the banners were obscured and the formations had broken down into a swirling melee of individual combats. This tactical advantage was so significant that the Hospitallers, the Templars' great rivals, adopted a similar red-on-white insignia for their own mantles in the late 12th century, though the Hospitallers eventually settled on a white cross on a red field to distinguish themselves from the Templars, creating the two iconic color schemes that would dominate the visual language of the military orders for centuries. The Red Cross, in short, was the perfect complement to the white mantle, a splash of sacrificial crimson that transformed the garment of purity into the garment of the soldier of Christ, a uniform that proclaimed to every observer, friend or foe, that the man who wore it had already died to the world and was ready to die in the flesh for the cause that the cross represented. The regulations governing the wearing of the white mantle were among the most detailed and rigorously enforced of all the Templar disciplinary codes, and they reveal a preoccupation with the garment that went far beyond the merely functional or symbolic, amounting to a comprehensive theology of dress that regulated every aspect of the knight's relationship to his uniform. The French rule, in its expanded form of the mid-13th century, devotes no fewer than 27 clauses to the subject of clothing, and the majority of these clauses are concerned with the proper use, care, and removal of the white mantle. The knight was required to wear the mantle at all times when he was not engaged in manual labor or private prayer in his cell, and even in those circumstances he was to keep the mantle close at hand, folded neatly on a stool beside him, ready to be donned at a moment's notice if the alarm was sounded or if the master summoned the chapter. The rule explicitly commands that the mantle must be worn during meals, during the divine office, during chapter meetings, during guard duty, and during battle, and the only permitted exception was the hour of sleep, when the knight was to remove the mantle and fold it at the foot of his bed. But even then he was required to sleep in his linen shirt and braise so that if the infidel attacked in the night he could spring from his bed, throw the mantle over his shoulders, and take up his sword, without any delay that might be caused by the need to dress. The punishment for appearing in public without the mantle was severe. A first offense earned 7 strokes of the discipline in the chapter house, a second offense earned 40 days of the ground penance eating only bread and water while kneeling on the floor of the refectory, and a third offense could result in the temporary or even permanent loss of the habit. A sentence that was considered only one step removed from the ultimate catastrophe of expulsion. The rule also regulated the way the mantle was to be folded and stored, and the draper or his deputy was required to inspect every mantle in the convent once a month to ensure that the fabric was not torn, stained, or worn through, because a knight who appeared in a ragged mantle was deemed to have brought dishonor upon the entire order and to have shown contempt for the sacred garment that was the sign of his profession. The psychological effect of these regulations was to bind the knight to his mantle in an almost physical union, to make the garment an extension of his body and his identity, so that the thought of appearing without it was as unnatural and shameful as the thought of appearing naked. The deposition of Brother Jean de Cugy, given before the papal commissioners in 1311, contains a poignant testimony to this psychological bond. When they took my mantle from me in the prison of the king, I felt as though my skin had been torn from my flesh, and I wept more bitterly than I had ever wept for the death of my father, for my father gave me only my mortal life, but the mantle had clothed me for eternal life. The regulations, in sum, were designed to produce a knight whose entire existence was wrapped in the white wool of the temple, whose sense of self was inseparable from the garment that marked him as a brother, and whose obedience to the rule was measured, in large part, by the care with which he treated the piece of cloth that was, for him, the nearest thing to a sacrament that a layman could receive. The social and psychological impact of the white mantle on the feudal nobility of Europe cannot be overstated, for the garment represented a direct challenge to the entire system of hereditary honor that was the foundation of aristocratic identity in the 12th and 13th centuries. The secular knight's identity was constructed upon a scaffolding of visible markers. His coat of arms, embroidered on his surcoat and painted on his shield, proclaimed his lineage and his place in the great chain of feudal allegiance. His sword, often a family heirloom with a name and a history, was a symbol of his right to exercise violence on behalf of his lord. His spurs, the quintessential emblem of knighthood, were buckled on in a ceremony that was as much a social initiation as a military one. The Templars' white mantle stripped away every one of these markers and replaced them with a blank field of undyed wool that declared, in its very blankness, the annulment of all hereditary distinction. A baron who took the Templar vow ceased to be a baron. He became a brother, and his coat of arms was struck from the rolls of the heralds as though he had never existed. A knight who could trace his ancestry to Charlemagne, or to the companions of William the Conqueror became, in the instant he donned the white mantle, simply one among many, his lineage swallowed up in the corporate anonymity of the temple, his personal glory submerged in the collective glory of the order. This loss of identity was profoundly disturbing to the secular aristocracy. and many noble families regarded a son's decision to join the Templars as a form of social death, a vanishing from the world of hereditary honor into a parallel world that operated according to incomprehensible rules. The troubadour poetry of the late 12th century contains several laments by mothers and wives who speak of their sons and husbands as having been lost to the white cloak, a phrase that captures the sense of the mantle as a shroud that buried the individual within a living death of monastic anonymity. Yet for the men who actually wore the mantle, the experience was often one of exhilarating liberation. The Chronicle of the Templar House of Richrinches records the testimony of a knight named Guillaume de Grignan, who entered the order in 1189 after a youth spent in the petty wars of the Provençal nobility. "I was a slave to my name, to my lands, to my feuds, to my pride, but when the master placed the white mantle on my shoulders, I felt all those chains fall away, and I became, for the first time in my life, a free man, because I was now a servant of Christ." This paradoxical freedom through service was the great secret of the Templar vocation, and the white mantle was the visible sign of that paradox. A garment of humility that was also a garment of liberation, a cloak of obedience that was also a cloak of release from the endless, exhausting performance of feudal masculinity. The white mantle, in short, was a garment that killed the old man and gave birth to the new, and it did so not through words or doctrines but through the immediate, physical experience of being wrapped in a cloth that had been blessed by the Church and that carried within its folds the promise of a salvation that no earthly honor could bestow, and no earthly disgrace could take away. The psychological revolution that the mantle effected in the individual knight was, in its own way, as radical as any political revolution, and its effects rippled outward from the chapter houses of the Temple to transform the entire culture of Western chivalry, which would never again be able to take its own heraldic pomp entirely seriously after the white-clad brothers had demonstrated that a knight could be great without a name and glorious without a coat of arms. The white mantle as a garment of social leveling extended its influence beyond the walls of the preceptory and into the broader structures of medieval society, where it functioned as a visible critique of the economic and political hierarchies that the feudal system had naturalized over the centuries. When a great lord and a landless knight-errant knelt together in the chapter house and received the same white mantle, the same undyed wool, the same red cross, the radical equality of the monastic profession was made visible in a way that no sermon could have achieved. The rule explicitly prohibited any brother from wearing a mantle that was finer or better made than the mantles of his fellows, and the draper was instructed to distribute the garments by lot, so that no favoritism could influence the assignment of a particularly well-woven piece of cloth to a knight of high birth. This scrupulous egalitarianism in the matter of dress was a constant source of friction with the aristocratic families who sent their sons to the temple, and the cartulary of the preceptory of Puyenveli records a formal complaint lodged in 1243 by the Count of Forez, who objected that his son, a knight of the temple, was forced to wear a mantle that was no better than the mantle of a peasant's son. The master's reply, preserved in the same cartulary, is a masterpiece of Templar intransigence. The temple does not know the sons of peasants or the sons of counts. It knows only brothers, and the mantle of a brother is the same whether he was born in a castle or a hovel. This reply, with its blunt assertion of the irrelevance of birth in the face of the monastic profession, was both a theological statement and a political provocation, and it explains why the secular nobility, who depended upon the visual performance of hierarchy for their authority, regarded the Templars with a mixture of admiration, resentment, and deep unease. The white mantle, in this political reading, was the garment of a meritocracy avant la lettre, a uniform that erased the accidents of birth and replaced them with the sole criterion of obedience to the rule, and its implications for the feudal order were potentially revolutionary. The Templars themselves, of course, had no intention of fomenting social revolution. Their radicalism was entirely contained within the walls of the convent and the structures of the church. But the mere existence of an institution in which the sons of nobles and the sons of peasants wore the same garment and obeyed the same rule was a standing reproach to a society that was built on the principle of hereditary inequality, and the white mantle, every time it appeared on the streets of a European city or on the road to a crusader port, served as a silent sermon on the vanity of earthly distinctions and the equality of all men before the judgment of God. The political and social dimensions of the mantle were never lost on the order's enemies. And when Philip the Fair moved against the Templars in 1307, one of the charges laid against them, alongside the grotesque accusations of heresy and sodomy, was that they had set themselves above the order of nature by refusing the distinctions that God has established among men. The white mantle, in this final, tragic irony, was condemned not only as a garment of superstition but as a garment of sedition, a piece of cloth that had dared to challenge the hierarchies that held the world together, and its destruction on the pyres of Paris was, among other things, a restoration of the old order of heraldic display and hereditary privilege. A return to a world in which a man's worth was measured by the colors he wore and the ancestors he could name rather than by the purity of his life and the sincerity of his obedience. The theological foundations of the white mantle extended deep into the soil of the Judeo-Christian scriptural tradition, drawing upon a complex web of biblical types, patristic commentaries, and liturgical symbolism that invested the simple woolen garment with a weight of sacred meaning that was unique in the history of military dress. The foundational text for the Templar understanding of the white mantle was the Book of Revelation, the great apocalyptic vision of St. John, in which the elect are repeatedly described as wearing white robes that have been washed in the blood of the Lamb, a paradox that the Templars embraced with the full force of their mystical imagination. The white of the mantle was not merely the white of cleanliness or the white of innocence. It was the white of martyrdom, the white of a garment that had been plunged into the crimson torrent of Christ's sacrifice and had emerged, impossibly, unstained. A miracle of divine grace that the Knight of the Temple reenacted every time he rode into battle wearing the color of the redeemed while carrying the red cross of the Redeemer on his heart. The Venerable Bede, the great Anglo-Saxon doctor of the Church, had commented in his 8th century commentary on the Apocalypse that the white robes of the saints signified the double purity of body and soul, the chastity of the flesh and the cleanness of the conscience. And this dual interpretation was taken up by the Templar chaplains and woven into the very fabric of the order's self-understanding. The knight who wore the white mantle was making a visible claim to this double purity, a claim that was audacious to the point of hubris but that was also, in the paradoxical logic of Christian asceticism, a confession of utter dependence on grace, because the mantle's whiteness was not the knight's own achievement, but a gift that he received from the order and that the order received from Christ through the mediation of the Church. The Bernardine theology that shaped the early Templar vocation added an additional layer of meaning to the white garment, drawing upon the Cistercian master's profound meditation on the Song of Songs, in which the bride is described as being white and ruddy, a combination of colors that Bernard read as signifying the purity of the contemplative life and the blood-red charity of the active life, the two poles between which the Templar existence oscillated with a violence that no purely contemplative order could match. The knight's white mantle, with its blood-red cross, was thus a visual exegesis of the Song of Songs, a garment that proclaimed the union of the active and contemplative, the marriage of Mary and Martha, the fusion of the sword and the censer that was the unique charism of the military order. The Old Testament provided its own rich vein of typology for the Templar mantle, particularly in the figure of the high priest's white linen garments described in the book of Leviticus, garments that were worn only by the descendants of Aaron and that signified the holiness required of those who approached the altar of the Lord. The Templars, who never claimed priestly ordination, nonetheless appropriated this priestly typology for their own mantle, arguing in their internal literature that the Knight of the Temple was a lay priest, who offered the sacrifice of his own body on the altar of the battlefield, and that the white mantle was his equivalent of the priest's linen ephod, the garment that marked him as set apart for a sacred function. This audacious claim to a kind of lay priesthood was one of the sources of the friction between the Templars and the diocesan clergy, who regarded the order's pretensions with a resentment that would eventually contribute to its downfall. The white mantle, in sum, was a garment so thickly encrusted with theological meaning that every thread could be read as a sentence of Scripture, every fold as a chapter of the Fathers, and the knight who wrapped himself in it was not merely dressing for battle but vesting for a liturgy of blood that was the highest form of worship the medieval imagination could conceive. The contrast between the white mantle of the knight and the black or brown mantle of the sergeant was one of the most visible manifestations of the internal hierarchy of the Templar order, a hierarchy that was not based on birth or wealth but on the spiritual status conferred by the knightly vocation. The rule's distinction between the two classes of brothers was absolute, and was enforced with the same rigor that characterized every other aspect of Templar discipline. The knight, who was required to be of legitimate knightly birth before his entry into the order, wore the white mantle as the sign of his full participation in the charism of the temple. He was a member of the chapter, he voted on the admission of new brothers and the sentencing of sinners, and he was eligible for the highest offices of the order, including the mastership itself. The sergeant, by contrast, whether he was a serving brother of free but non-noble birth or a brother-at-arms who fought alongside the knights, wore the black or brown mantle that marked him as a subordinate member of the fraternity, a man who served the temple with his labor and his sword but who did not share in the fullness of the spiritual privileges that the white garment represented. The sergeants were not permitted to vote in the chapter, they could not be elected to the higher offices, and they were excluded from certain of the more intimate rituals of the order's life, including the private chapter meetings at which the most sensitive matters of discipline and governance were discussed. This distinction, which might seem invidious to a modern egalitarian sensibility, was accepted by the sergeants themselves as a reflection of the natural order of the Church and the cosmos, an order in which every soul had its proper place and its proper function, and in which the white of the angels and the black of the penitent were both necessary colors in the great tapestry of creation. The sergeant's brown or black mantle was not, in the order's theology, a mark of disgrace but a mark of humility, a garment of penance that suited men who, in the words of the rule, serve the temple in the lesser things that the knights may serve it in the greater. The practical consequence of this color coding was an immediate visual legibility that allowed any observer, within the order or outside it, to identify the rank and function of every brother at a glance. In the refectory, the white mantles sat at one table and the black at another. On the march, the white mantles rode at the front of the column and the black brought up the rear. In the chapter house, the white mantles sat on the stone benches while the black knelt or stood against the walls. This visual hierarchy was so effective that the Templars never developed the elaborate system of badges, stars, and crosses that modern armies use to distinguish ranks. The color of the mantle was rank enough, and any further elaboration would have been a violation of the principle of simplicity that was the aesthetic corollary of the order's poverty. The white mantle, in this internal economy of color, was thus a garment of privilege but also of burden, a cloth that elevated the knight above his sergeant brothers but that also subjected him to a standard of conduct and a severity of punishment that the sergeants, protected by their darker garments, did not have to face. The knight who sinned in the white mantle was punished more harshly than the sergeant who committed the same sin in black, because the white cloth magnified the offense and made it more visible to the eyes of God and the chapter. The color of the mantle was, in the end, a color of accountability, and the white was the color of those who had been entrusted with the greatest responsibilities and who would be held to the strictest account for their fulfillment. The white mantle's role as a garment of battle was the ultimate test of its practical and symbolic efficacy, and the historical record of Templar engagements from the Second Crusade to the fall of Acre is filled with episodes in which the white wool played a decisive role in the outcome of the fighting. The primary function of the mantle in combat was as a means of identification, a unifying visual signal that allowed the Templar cavalry to operate as a single coordinated body in an environment where the dust, the noise, and the terror of the melee rendered verbal commands and audible signals almost useless. The Templar charge, which was the order's signature tactic, depended for its success on the precise timing and the absolute cohesion of the knights. If even a few riders hesitated or broke formation, the shock of the charge would be dissipated and the entire squadron would be vulnerable to being surrounded and cut down by the more numerous and more mobile Saracen light cavalry. The white mantle, visible through the clouds of dust and the flashing of steel, served as a beacon that held the line together, a moving wall of pale fabric that every rider could see in his peripheral vision and that allowed him to maintain his exact position in the formation without having to look away from the enemy in front of him. The chronicler of the Battle of Arsuf, the great Templar victory of 1191 in which the Master Robert de Sable led the decisive charge against the army of Saladin, records that the brothers of the temple, clad in their white mantles, advanced as though they were a single creature with 1,000 legs, and the Saracens, who had never before seen such a sight, were struck with a great terror before even the first lance was lowered. The psychological impact of the white-clad charge on the Muslim defenders was, by all accounts, profound and lasting. The white mantle, in the Islamic imagination, was associated with the burial shroud, the garment of the dead, and the sight of hundreds of riders dressed in the color of the grave, bearing down with lances leveled and the red cross blazing on their breasts, conjured a host of eschatological fears that the more rational commanders of the Ayyubid and Mamluk armies struggled to control among their troops. The Templars were fully aware of this psychological effect and exploited it ruthlessly, often timing their charges for the late afternoon, when the low sun would catch the white wool and make it blaze with a light that seemed, to the defenders on the walls, almost supernatural, a river of fire descending from the sky to sweep away the armies of the infidel. The mantle also served a protective function in the chaos of the close-quarter fighting that followed the initial charge. When the lances were broken and the swords were drawn, the white mantle was often grabbed by enemy soldiers who sought to pull the knight from his horse or to immobilize him for a killing blow. The Templars, anticipating this tactic, were trained to use the mantle's loose fit to their advantage. A knight whose mantle was seized could slip his arm out of the garment and continue fighting in his mail, leaving the attacker clutching a handful of empty wool while the knight's sword descended on his unprotected neck. The rule even contains a clause that permits a knight to abandon his mantle on the battlefield if it becomes entangled with the enemy, or with the gear of a fallen horse, a rare concession to practicality in a code that otherwise demanded the wearing of the mantle in all circumstances. The white mantle, in the brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare, was thus a calculated risk. It made the knight a more visible target, but it also made him part of a coordinated fighting unit that was far more lethal than any collection of individual warriors, and the Templar commanders consistently judged that the benefits of the uniform outweighed its dangers. A judgment that was vindicated by 2 centuries of almost uninterrupted military success against numerically superior opponents. The relationship between the white mantle and the Templar vow of chastity was one of the most intimate and most psychologically charged aspects of the order's spirituality. A connection that was inscribed in the very language of the rule and that shaped the daily experience of every knight who wore the garment. The white wool, as the rule repeatedly emphasizes, was a sign of bodily purity, a phrase that in the medieval context referred primarily to the renunciation of sexual activity but that also encompassed a broader ideal of physical integrity, a rejection of all the pollutions of the flesh that were understood to separate the soul from God. The knight who put on the white mantle was, in a very real sense, putting on his chastity, making a public promise of continence that was as binding as the marriage vow and that was enforced with the same severity by the spiritual courts of the order. The connection between the white garment and sexual purity was deeply rooted in the Christian symbolic tradition, going back to the white baptismal robes that the newly baptized wore during the Easter Vigil as a sign that their sins, and particularly the sins of the flesh, had been washed away by the waters of regeneration. The Templar investiture ceremony deliberately echoed the baptismal rite, with the candidate stripped of his old clothing, questioned about his faith, and then clothed in a new white garment that signified his entry into a new life of chastity and obedience. The psychological burden of this symbolism was immense, because the knight who wore the white mantle was making a claim to angelic purity that was almost impossibly high, a claim that every nocturnal emission, every involuntary thought, every glance at a woman's face seemed to mock and to undermine. The rule's draconian penalties for sexual sin, the loss of the habit for a single proven act of fornication, and expulsion for repeated offenses or for the abominable sin against nature, or the juridical expression of the theology of the white mantle, a theology that could tolerate no compromise with the flesh because the garment that proclaimed purity would become a lie if the body beneath it was defiled. The confessors of the order, who heard the knight's most intimate confessions in the darkness of the chapter house, were trained to probe the consciences of their penitents with a particular focus on the sins that would stain the white mantle, and the penitential manuals that circulated among the Templar chaplains contained long and detailed lists of questions about dreams, thoughts, and solitary acts that might indicate a hidden corruption beneath the spotless wool. The psychological pressure of this scrutiny was so intense that many knights developed a morbid obsession with the state of their mantles, checking the fabric repeatedly for stains that only they could see, symbols of a guilt that had not yet been confessed and that would, they feared, one day be made visible to the entire chapter in a miracle of divine revelation. The white mantle, in this neurotic register, was not merely a garment but a mirror of the soul, a cloth that reflected the inner state of the wearer with a merciless clarity that no other piece of clothing could match. The vow of chastity, lived under the sign of the white wool, was thus the most demanding of all the Templar obligations, the one that required the most constant vigilance, and the most frequent recourse to the strap of the discipline, which was understood, in part, as a means of purifying the flesh from the stains that the white mantle was too honest to conceal. The white mantle as a garment of corporate identity functioned not only to erase individual distinctions among the brothers but also to create a powerful sense of belonging to a body that transcended the limitations of space and time. A mystical corporation that included not only the living knights in the preceptories of Europe and the East but also the dead brothers who had fallen in battle, and whose souls were believed to be interceding for the order before the throne of God. The rule explicitly states that the white mantle is the same garment that the first brothers received from the Patriarch of Jerusalem in 1119, and this fiction of an unbroken material continuity was maintained with the same scrupulous care that characterized every other aspect of Templar observance. When a knight died, his mantle was not buried with him but was returned to the draper, who inspected it for damage, repaired it if possible, and then reissued it to a new knight, so that the same piece of wool might clothe 5 or 6 successive brothers over the course of a century, each of whom was linked by the shared garment to the long chain of his predecessors. This practice of reusing the mantles was not merely a matter of economy, though the order's treasurers certainly appreciated the savings. It was a deliberate strategy for reinforcing the sense of historical continuity that was one of the primary sources of Templar morale. The knight who received a mantle that had been worn by a brother who fell at the Battle of Montgisard or at the Siege of Ascalon was not merely putting on a piece of clothing, he was entering into a communion with the martyrs of the order, taking up the same cloth that had been soaked in the blood of his predecessors and that carried, in its fibers, a kind of spiritual radioactivity that would strengthen him for his own coming trials. The psychological effect of this practice was particularly powerful for the young knights who entered the order in the 13th century, when the great victories of the early Crusades were already passing into legend and the sense of living in a diminished present was beginning to erode the confidence of the Frankish settlers in the East. To wear a mantle that had been worn at the Battle of Arsuf or at the defense of Safed was to touch the heroic past and to be touched by it in return, to feel the weight of the order's history on one's shoulders and to be strengthened by the knowledge that one was part of a story that would continue long after one's own death. The white mantle, in this communal and historical dimension, was the sacrament of Templar solidarity, a visible bond that united the living and the dead, the knight in the preceptory of London and the knight in the castle of Almarkeb, the novice who had just received his first mantle and the master who had worn his for half a century. The corporate identity that the mantle created was so powerful that even the order's enemies recognized it and respected it. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars, after capturing the fortress of Safed in 1266, ordered that the white mantles of the slain Templars be collected and sent to the Grand Master in Acre as a gesture of respect for the courage of the defenders. A rare act of chivalric courtesy in a war that was otherwise characterized by a brutality that shocked even the hardened sensibilities of the 13th century. The white mantle, in the end, was the body of the temple made visible, a cloth that was more than a cloth, a garment that was more than a garment, a uniform that was not a uniform but a second flesh that bound the brothers together into a single organism that could be wounded but never divided, killed but never defeated, suppressed but never extinguished, because the mantle, unlike the men who wore it, was eternal. The sensory experience of wearing the white mantle, the weight of the wool on the shoulders, the scratch of the undyed fibers against the neck, the smell of the lanolin that rose from the fabric in the heat of the Syrian sun, was an integral part of the Templars' daily formation, a constant physical reminder of the identity that the garments signified and the obligations that it imposed. The rule's prohibition on any kind of lining or padding meant that the knight's skin was in direct contact with the coarse wool, a sensation that was intensely uncomfortable in the first weeks of wearing but that, over time, became so familiar that its absence was felt as a kind of phantom pain, a sensory vacuum that left the knight disoriented and anxious. The weight of the mantle, which in its full-length woolen form could reach nearly 5 kilograms when dry and significantly more when soaked with rain or sweat, was a constant physical presence that shaped the knight's posture, his gait, and even his breathing. Pulling his shoulders back and his chest forward in the erect stance that was the characteristic bearing of the Templar, and that contributed to the impression of arrogance that the secular clergy and the rival military orders so often complained of. The smell of the mantle was equally important in the sensory economy of the Templar life. The wool, even when new, had a distinctive odor of lanolin and the herbs that were used in the fulling process, and this smell, mingled with the knight's own sweat and the dust of the road and the incense of the chapel, created a unique olfactory signature that the brothers learned to associate with the safety and the discipline of the convent. When a knight was away from the preceptory on a mission or a campaign, the smell of his own mantle, which he wrapped around himself at night as a blanket, was a comfort that reminded him of the chapter house and the refectory and the silent dormitory, a sensory anchor that kept him connected to the order even when he was alone in the wilderness. The sound of the mantle was another dimension of its sensory presence. The heavy woolen fabric made a distinctive swishing noise when the knight walked, and the rustle of 100 mantles moving in unison during the procession into the chapel was a sound that the brothers came to know as intimately as the sound of the bell that called them to prayer. The rule's insistence on silence in the dormitory and the refectory meant that the rustle of the mantles was often the only sound in the convent besides the chanting of the office and the murmured confessions in the chapter house, and the brothers learned to interpret the subtle variations in that rustle, the quick, nervous swish of a knight who was anxious about an upcoming punishment, the slow, measured sweep of a master who was making his rounds of the infirmary, as a language of its own, a textile semiotics that conveyed information about the emotional state of the wearer with a precision that words could not match. The white mantle, in short, was a garment that engaged every sense and that saturated the consciousness of the wearer to a degree that is difficult for modern people, whose clothing is light and disposable and devoid of symbolic weight, to fully appreciate. The Knight of the Temple did not merely wear his mantle, he inhabited it, and it inhabited him, and the boundary between the man and the garment was so porous that it was often impossible to say where the wool ended and the soul began. The maintenance and care of the white mantle were subjects of elaborate regulation and constant anxiety within the Templar convents, because the purity of the garment was understood to be a direct reflection of the purity of the wearer, and a stained or torn mantle was not merely a breach of discipline but a visible scandal that brought discredit upon the entire order. The rule devotes an entire section to the washing of the mantles, specifying that they were to be laundered by the sergeants of the house, not by outside servants, and that the water used for the washing was to be drawn from a well within the precincts of the preceptory to ensure that it was not contaminated by contact with the secular world. The washing process was laborious and time-consuming. The woolen mantles could not be boiled or agitated too vigorously without felting the fibers and ruining the cloth, so they were soaked in a mixture of cold water and wood ash, which acted as a mild alkali to loosen the dirt, and then gently beaten with wooden paddles before being rinsed in multiple changes of clean water and laid out to dry on the grass of the cloister garth, where the sunlight would bleach them to the desired shade of creamy white. The drying mantles were guarded by a sergeant to prevent birds from soiling them or thieves from stealing them, a precaution that might seem excessive until one recalls that a single mantle represented a significant investment of the order's resources and that the loss of even a few mantles could disrupt the careful economy of the draper's stores. The rule also addresses the repair of damaged mantles, commanding that tiers were to be mended with thread of the same color, and that patches were to be of the same quality of wool, so that the repair would be invisible and the garment would retain its seamless perfection. A knight whose mantle was irreparably damaged was required to present himself before the draper and to explain the circumstances of the damage, and if the damage was judged to be the result of carelessness or neglect, the knight was subject to the discipline of the chapter and to the temporary loss of his mantle. A punishment that was dreaded not only for the shame it inflicted but for the practical discomfort of being without the garment that was the knight's primary protection against the elements. The maintenance of the mantle was thus a discipline in its own right, a daily practice of care and attention that cultivated the virtues of patience, diligence, and reverence for the material objects that the order's theology had invested with sacred significance. The white mantle, in this practical dimension, was a school of virtue, a piece of cloth that taught the knight, through the endless round of washing, drying, and mending, the lesson that the care of small things was the foundation of the care of great things, and that a man who could not be trusted to keep his mantle clean could not be trusted to hold a castle against the infidel. The white mantle's role in the Templar funeral rites was the final and most poignant expression of the garment's sacramental character, a ritual that transformed the piece of wool into a burial shroud and that completed the circle of meaning that had begun with the investiture ceremony on the day of the knight's entry into the order. When a Templar died, whether in battle or in the infirmary, his body was washed by the brothers and then wrapped in his own white mantle, which was folded around him like a winding sheet and secured with leather thongs, so that the garment that had been the sign of his living profession became the garment of his eternal rest. The rule specifies that the knight was to be buried in his mantle, without a coffin, laid directly in the earth of the cemetery of the preceptory, with his feet pointing toward the east and his arms crossed over his chest, the red cross of the mantle positioned directly over his heart, so that when the archangel sounded the trumpet of resurrection, the first thing the knight's awakened eyes would see would be the sign of his salvation emblazoned on his own breast. The funeral mass was celebrated with the full solemnity of the Templar liturgy. The brothers gathered around the open grave in their white mantles, their hoods drawn up over their heads, chanting the office of the dead in the low, rumbling tones that the order's musical tradition had developed over the centuries. The body, wrapped in its white shroud, was lowered into the grave by the hands of the dead knight's closest companions, and each brother then cast a handful of earth onto the white bundle, a gesture that was both a farewell and a promise, a commitment to join the dead brother in the communion of the saints when their own time came. The mantle, in this funeral context, was a garment of hope, a cloth that testified to the faith of the order that the purity it had proclaimed in life would be vindicated in death, and that the brother who had worn the white wool in the service of the temple would be given, in the heavenly Jerusalem, a new white robe that would never be stained and never wear out. The cemetery of the Templar Preceptory of London, excavated in the 19th century, yielded a number of skeletons that were still wrapped in the remnants of their white woolen shrouds, the fabric preserved by the peculiar chemistry of the London clay, and the archaeologists who studied these remains noted that in several cases the red cross could still be discerned, a faint pinkish stain on the brown wool. A ghost of the color that had once blazed on the battlefield and that now, after 7 centuries in the earth, was the only trace that remained of the men who had worn the most famous uniform in the history of warfare. The addition of the red cross to the white mantle in 1147, authorized by Pope Eugene III in the bull Mightiest Templi, was the moment at which the Templar uniform achieved its definitive form, the synthesis of the two colors that would define the order's visual identity for the next 165 years, and that would become, in the words of the chronicler William of Tyre, the banner under which the enemies of Christ were vanquished, and the friends of Christ were comforted. The historical context of the cross's adoption is crucial for understanding its significance. The Second Crusade was collapsing in disaster. The armies of Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany had been shattered by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, and the remnants of the crusading host were huddled in Antioch and Acre, their morale destroyed and their resources exhausted. It was in this atmosphere of despair and recrimination that the Templars, under the leadership of the Master Everard de Bars, emerged as the one functioning military organization capable of salvaging something from the wreckage of the Crusade, and the grant of the Red Cross was, in part, a recognition by the papacy of the order's unique status as the last best hope of the Latin kingdom. The cross was initially embroidered by the knights themselves, using thread that had been dyed with madder root, a plant that had been cultivated in the Mediterranean since antiquity and that produced a deep, brick-red color that was relatively fast and that did not fade to pink as quickly as the cheaper dyes that were used for common clothing. The embroidery was done in a simple cross petit, a form of cross with arms that were narrow at the center and widened toward the ends, a shape that was already associated with the crusading movement and that would, by the end of the 12th century, be universally recognized as the emblem of the Templar order. The rules specified that the cross was to be of a hand's breadth, in size roughly 4 inches across, and that it was to be placed On the left breast over the heart, so that the love of the crucified Christ may be ever before the eyes of the brother, and the fear of his judgment ever in his thoughts. The placement over the heart was, as we have seen, deeply symbolic, but it also had a practical function. The cross, stitched onto the thickest part of the mantle, provided a small measure of additional protection over the knight's most vulnerable spot, a textile relic of the faith that would, the brothers believed, deflect the arrows and the lance thrusts that were aimed at the heart of the soldier of Christ. The psychological impact of the cross on the brothers themselves was immediate and profound. The white mantle, which had always been a garment of purity, was now also a garment of sacrifice, a cloth that marked the wearer as a man who had already offered his life to God and who was merely waiting for the moment of that offering to be accepted. The knight who looked down at his own chest and saw the red cross was looking at the sign of his own death, a death that he had freely chosen and that he was expected to embrace with the joy of a bridegroom going to meet his bride. The Muslim enemies of the order, who were acute observers of Frankish symbolism, immediately understood the significance of the Red Cross and incorporated it into their own narratives of the Templar threat. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing of the Battle of Hattin in 1187, describes how Saladin's soldiers, after the battle, stripped the mantles from the dead Templars and trampled the red crosses in the dust, a gesture of contempt that was also, paradoxically, a tribute to the power of the symbol they were attempting to destroy. The red cross on the white mantle functioned as a powerful talisman in the spiritual economy of the Templar order, a visible focus of devotion that the knights were encouraged to contemplate during the long hours of guard duty, the silent meals in the refectory, and the sleepless nights before a battle. The chaplains of the order, in their sermons and their private conferences, developed an elaborate mystical theology of the cross, drawing upon the traditions of the Cistercian school and the Victorine spirituality of 12th century Paris, to teach the knights that the red emblem on their breasts was not merely a piece of colored cloth but a real participation in the cross of Calvary. A fragment of the true cross that had been transposed into wool, and that carried within it the power of the Passion. The knight was instructed to meditate on the cross during his daily prayers, to trace its outline with his finger as a form of tactile prayer, and to kiss it before he drew his sword in battle, a gesture that transformed the combat that followed into an act of devotion, a liturgy of blood in which the knight's own wounds were united with the wounds of Christ and his own death was a sharing in the death that had redeemed the world. This theology of the cross as sacrament was, of course, a dangerous one from the perspective of Orthodox Catholic doctrine, which reserved the real presence of Christ to the consecrated host and the chalice of the Eucharist. And the Templars' tendency to blur the line between the cross on the mantle and the cross of Calvary was one of the factors that made the order vulnerable to the charges of heresy and superstition that would eventually be brought against it by the French crown. But within the closed world of the Templar convent, the theology of the Red Cross was a source of immense spiritual power, a belief that transformed the white mantle from a garment of purity into a garment of power, a cloth that was charged with the very energy of the redemption and that made the knight who wore it, in the words of the Templar hymn that has come down to us in a single manuscript from the preceptory of Arville, a living crucifix, a walking altar, a sacrifice that offers itself for the sins of the people. The Red Cross, in this mystical understanding, was the engine that drove the Templar war machine, the source of the courage that allowed a few hundred knights to charge into the teeth of armies that outnumbered them by 10 or 20 to 1. And the battlefields of the Crusades were littered with the bodies of men who had fought with a ferocity that their enemies could only explain as a form of demonic possession but that the Templars themselves understood as the working of the cross, the power of the Passion flowing through the wool and into the heart, and out through the sword and into the bodies of the infidels who were, in the mysterious providence of God, the instruments of the knight's own salvation. The heraldic and legal significance of the Red Cross extended far beyond the boundaries of the Templar order, creating a body of customary and canon law that regulated the use of the emblem and that gave the Templars a unique juridical status in the courts of Europe and the Latin East. The Red Cross on the white field was, in the technical language of medieval heraldry, the arms of the temple, and as such it was protected by the same body of customary law that governed the use of all coats of arms, a law that was enforced by the heralds in the secular sphere and by the ecclesiastical courts in the spiritual sphere. The unauthorized wearing of the Templar cross was a serious offense, punishable in the secular courts by fines and imprisonment, and in the spiritual courts by excommunication, because the cross was not merely a decoration but a sign of membership in an order that was directly subject to the Pope and that enjoyed immunities and privileges that no other military force could claim. The Templars were zealous in the defense of their heraldic monopoly, and the cartularies of the order are filled with records of lawsuits brought against secular knights who had adopted a red cross on a white field as their personal device, either out of admiration for the order or in an attempt to borrow some of the Templars' prestige and military reputation. In one notable case, recorded in the archives of the Parliament of Paris in 1263, a knight of the Vermandois named Enguerrand de Coucy was forced to abandon a new coat of arms that featured a red cross on a white shield after the Templar preceptor of Laon filed a formal protest, arguing that the device was the exclusive property of the poor knights of the Temple, granted to them by the Holy Father and confirmed by the usage of a century. The court ruled in favor of the Templars, and Enguerrand de Coucy was compelled to change his arms to a red cross on a blue field, a decision that established an important precedent for the legal protection of military religious insignia and that was cited in heraldic treatises for centuries afterward. The Red Cross also served as a passport and a safe conduct for the brothers who traveled on the business of the order. The man who wore the cross was entitled to free passage through the territories of any Christian lord, to exemption from tolls and taxes, and to the hospitality of any monastery or cathedral chapter. Privileges that were enforced by the threat of papal excommunication against any who dared to interfere with a brother of the Temple in the performance of his duties. The cross, in this legal dimension, was the key that unlocked the gates of Christendom for the Knights of the Temple, a visible sign of the papal protection that made the order, in effect, a sovereign entity whose members could move through the fragmented political landscape of medieval Europe with an immunity that even the greatest secular lords could not claim for themselves. The red cross on the white mantle was thus not merely a symbol but a legal instrument, a piece of cloth that carried within its threads the authority of the papacy and the threat of the Church's most terrible sanctions, and the knight who wore it was not merely a soldier, but a living embodiment of the jurisdictional autonomy that was the most controversial and the most envied of all the Templar privileges. The manufacturing and distribution of the red crosses for the mantles of the order developed into a significant logistical operation that was managed by the draper of the temple with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized every other aspect of Templar administration. The crosses were not, as might be supposed, embroidered directly onto the mantles by the knights themselves, except in the very earliest years of the order. By the middle of the 12th century, the production of the crosses had been centralized in the great Templar workshops of Acre and Paris, where skilled embroiderers, many of them women from the devout lay communities that attached themselves to the order, worked full-time to produce the thousands of crosses that were needed each year to replace those that were worn out, lost in battle, or buried with the dead. The embroidery was executed in a chain-stitch technique that was both durable and relatively quick to produce, using a heavy linen thread that had been dyed with the madder root to the deep red color that the rule demanded, and the finished crosses were then inspected by a sergeant of the draper's office, who measured each one against a template to ensure that it conformed to the prescribed dimensions and rejected any that were too large, too small, or irregular in shape. The crosses were then distributed to the preceptories in bundles of 100, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from damp, and the preceptor of each house was required to keep a careful inventory of the crosses in his possession, accounting for every one that was issued and every one that was returned as worn out, in a system of bureaucratic control that anticipated the quartermaster corps of modern armies. The attachment of the cross to the mantle was itself a ritualized procedure. The knight who received a new cross was expected to fast and to make his confession before sewing it onto his mantle, and the sewing was done in silence, as a form of meditation on the Passion, with the knight's own fingers guiding the needle through the wool, stitching the sign of his salvation onto the garment of his purity with his own hands. The rule specifies that the cross was to be sewn onto the mantle with red thread, so that the stitches would be invisible, and that the sewing was to be done with care and with devotion, as befits a work that is done for the honor of God and of the Blessed Virgin. The act of sewing the cross onto the mantle was, in this understanding, a sacramental act, a reenactment of the nailing of Christ to the cross, and the knight who performed it was, in a mystical sense, nailing himself to the wood of his own sacrifice, binding himself to the obligation of martyrdom with every pass of the needle through the wool. The Red Cross, when it was finally in place, was the seal of the temple on the knight's body, a mark that could not be removed without the permission of the chapter, and that would remain on the mantle until the day of the knight's death, when it would go with him into the grave as a witness before the angels that he had kept the faith and fought the good fight to the end. The visual impact of the Red Cross on the white mantle in the context of a medieval battlefield was, by all contemporary accounts, one of the most overwhelming aesthetic experiences that the age of the Crusades produced, a spectacle that combined the beauty of a liturgical procession with the terror of an approaching avalanche. The chronicler of the Third Crusade, Ambrose, who witnessed the Templar charge at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, left a description that captures the sensory shock of the sight. And then the brothers of the Temple, who were in the van, put their lances in rest and spurred their horses, and the white of their mantles and the red of their crosses blazed in the afternoon sun like a river of milk and blood, and the thunder of their hooves was like the sound of the sea breaking on the rocks, and the Saracens, who had never before seen such a sight, turned and fled before the lances had even touched them, so great was the terror that the vision of the cross had cast upon them. The combination of white and red, in the color symbolism of the Middle Ages, was uniquely potent. White was the color of the supernatural, the color of angels and miracles and the transfigured body of Christ. Red was the color of sacrifice, the color of martyrs and passion and the blood that was the currency of salvation, and the fusion of the two in the Templar uniform created a chromatic icon that was, in its impact on the medieval retina, the equivalent of a vision of heaven opening and the armies of the Lord descending to do battle with the forces of darkness. The Templar commanders were fully aware of the psychological power of their uniform and deployed it with a theatrical flair that suggests a sophisticated understanding of the psychology of intimidation. The order's preference for attacking at dawn or at dusk, when the low angle of the sun would catch the white mantles and make them glow with an unearthly light, was not merely a tactical preference but a calculated piece of visual warfare, a manipulation of the natural lighting conditions to enhance the supernatural aura that the white and red uniform projected. The Saracen armies, for their part, developed a superstitious dread of the Templar cross that the more rationalistic emirs tried vainly to combat with theological arguments. The cross, after all, was a Christian symbol, and the Muslim faith held that the crucifixion of Jesus was an illusion, so why should the warriors of Islam fear a piece of cloth that represented a lie? But the arguments of the theologians had little purchase on the imaginations of the common soldiers, who had seen their comrades cut down by the white and red knights at Montgisard, at Arsuf, at La Fourby, and at 100 smaller engagements, and who had come to believe, with the stubborn conviction of experience, that the men who wore the Red Cross were not ordinary mortals but demons in human form. Creatures whose flesh could be pierced but whose spirits could not be conquered. The Red Cross, in this psychological warfare, was the Templars' most effective weapon, a silent scream of red on white that spoke directly to the ancient fears that lurked beneath the surface of the Muslim consciousness, fears of the jinn and the Ifrit, and the other uncanny beings that haunted the deserts and the ruins, and that the Templars, in their white mantles and their red crosses, seemed to embody and to unleash upon the armies of the faithful. The theological controversies that swirled around the Red Cross in the 12th and 13th centuries anticipated, in many ways, the debates that would later engulf the entire order in the fires of the Inquisition, and they revealed the deep ambivalence that the church hierarchy felt toward a symbol that had acquired, in the popular imagination, an almost idolatrous power. The Cistercian order, which had been the nursing mother of the temple in its infancy and which continued to supply many of its chaplains and its spiritual directors, was deeply uneasy about the cult of the Red Cross that had grown up among the Templar Knights, a cult that seemed, to the rigorous eyes of the white monks, to verge on a kind of fetishism, a superstitious attachment to a material object that was, after all, only a piece of dyed wool. Bernard of Clairvaux, had he lived to see the full flowering of the Templar devotion to the cross, might have been alarmed by the excesses that his own theology of the Crusade had inadvertently licensed. But Bernard had died in 1153, only 6 years after the cross was granted. And his successors in the leadership of the Cistercian order were less inclined to rein in the Templars' enthusiasm for a symbol that was, after all, producing tangible results on the battlefields of the East. The secular clergy, however, were not so reticent. The bishops and the abbots of the diocese in which the Templars held preceptories resented the order's exemption from their jurisdiction, and they seized upon the cult of the Red Cross as evidence that the Templars were teaching doctrines that were, at best, theologically unsound and, at worst, heretical. The Bishop of Acre, Jacques de Vitry, who was himself a man of considerable learning and a sympathetic observer of the military orders, recorded in his Historia Orientalis a conversation with a Templar knight who told him, in all sincerity, that the Red Cross on his mantle had the power to forgive sins and to open the gates of paradise. A claim that the bishop felt obliged to correct, but that he also recognized as a natural, if theologically imprecise, expression of the faith that sustained the Knights in their desperate struggle. The tension between the orthodox theology of the cross, which located the power of salvation in the historical event of the crucifixion and in the sacramental system of the Church, and the popular theology of the Templars, which invested the red woolen emblem with a direct and quasi-sacramental efficacy, was never satisfactorily resolved. And it contributed to the cloud of suspicion that gathered around the order in the decades before its suppression. The Red Cross, in this theological perspective, was a symbol that had escaped the control of its creators, a piece of cloth that had taken on a life of its own and that threatened, in the eyes of the ecclesiastical authorities, to become a rival to the cross of wood that stood on the altar of every church in Christendom. The Red Cross as a mark of distinction in the complex social world of the Crusader states functioned to create a visible boundary between the Templars and all other categories of Frankish society, a boundary that was both a source of pride for the brothers and a source of resentment for those who were excluded from the white and red elite. The secular knights of the Latin kingdom, many of whom were the descendants of the original Crusaders and who regarded the defense of the Holy Land as their hereditary right, found themselves increasingly marginalized by the military orders, whose discipline, resources, and papal protection gave them a decisive advantage in the competition for the limited manpower and money that were available for the defense of the kingdom. The sight of the Templar cross, which had once been a symbol of hope and solidarity, became, by the middle of the 13th century, a symbol of the privileges and the arrogance of an order that seemed to answer to no one but the Pope and that treated the local barons with a contempt that was all the more galling because it was expressed, not in words, but in the silent eloquence of the white mantle and the red cross that the barons were not permitted to wear. The tension between the Templars and the secular nobility erupted periodically into open conflict, most notably in the so-called War of the Lombards in 1228 to 1229, when the Templars and the forces of the Emperor Frederick II clashed in the streets of Acre over the question of who had the right to govern the kingdom during the minority of the young King Conrad. The Templars, who had adopted the white mantle and the red cross as the uniform of their defiance, fought the imperial troops with a ferocity that shocked even the hardened veterans of the Crusades, and the chronicler Philip of Navarra records that the Knights of the Temple, seeing the cross on their breasts, remembered that they were the soldiers of Christ and not the servants of any earthly emperor, and they charged the Lombards with a courage that was beyond nature. The Red Cross, in this episode and in many others like it, functioned as a political as well as a religious symbol, a declaration that the Templars acknowledged no master but the Pope and no law but the rule, and that their obedience to the secular authorities was strictly conditional on those authorities' willingness to respect the order's autonomy. The political charge of the Red Cross was not lost on the kings of Europe, who watched the growth of the military orders with a mixture of admiration and alarm, and when Philip the Fair of France decided to destroy the Templars in 1307, the Red Cross was one of the first things his propagandists attacked, accusing the order of having perverted the sacred symbol into an object of idolatrous worship and of having used it to justify a program of rebellion against the legitimate authority of the crown. The Red Cross, in the end, was a symbol that had become too powerful for its own good, a piece of red wool that had accumulated so much meaning, so much passion, so much history, that it had become, in the eyes of the order's enemies, a threat that had to be extinguished by any means necessary, and the flames that consumed the last Templar mantles in 1314 were the final tragic testimony to the potency of the emblem that had once been the pride of Christendom and the terror of the infidel. The daily life of the White Mantle within the Templar convent was governed by a detailed code of usage that transformed the simple act of wearing a garment into a continuous liturgical performance. A walking prayer that sanctified every hour of the knight's waking existence, and that turned the preceptory into a theater of sacred dress. The knight rose before dawn, at the hour of matins, and his first conscious act was to reach for his mantle, which lay folded on a stool beside his narrow bed, its white wool pale in the darkness of the dormitory, its red cross a faint smudge of color that was the first thing his eyes focused on as sleep released its hold on his mind. He shrugged the mantle over his linen shirt and brace, the wool scratchy against his skin in the cold of the early morning, and he pulled the hood over his head as he walked, barefoot, to the chapel, where the chaplain was already lighting the candles on the altar, and the other brothers were assembling in their white ranks, their mantles rustling in the silence like the wings of a flock of angels. The rule specifies that the mantle was to be worn for all the offices of the day, from matins through lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, and the knight who missed an office without the permission of the preceptor was subject to the discipline of the chapter, a punishment that was administered with a cruel irony, while the offender was stripped of the very mantle that he had neglected to wear in the service of the Lord. The mantle accompanied the knight to the refectory, where he sat on a wooden bench at a long table, his white wool brushing against the white wool of the brothers on either side of him, a tactile communion that reinforced the spiritual communion of the fraternal meal. The rule's prohibition on conversation during meals meant that the only sounds in the refectory were the clinking of wooden bowls and clay cups, the murmur of the lector reading from the martyrology, or the rule, and the constant, soft rustle of the mantles as the brothers raised their food to their mouths, wiped their lips on the sleeves of their garments, and shifted on the hard benches. The mantle was the knight's constant companion through the hours of labor that filled the time between the offices. He wore it as he groomed his horse in the stables, the white wool picking up the smell of hay and leather and the warm, sweet scent of the animal's hide. He wore it as he practiced with his sword in the training yard, the mantle billowing behind him as he lunged and parried, the red cross flapping against his chest like a bird trying to take flight. He wore it as he sat in the scriptorium, copying the rule or the accounts of the house, the ink-stained fingers of his right hand careful not to touch the white wool that covered his left arm. The mantle was only removed for the most intimate of activities, the weekly bath, the monthly bleeding that was prescribed by the infirmarian, the private confession that took place in the corner of the chapel, and even then it was never far away, folded on a stool or hung on a peg, waiting to be resumed as soon as the necessary act was completed. The knight's relationship with his mantle was, in short, the closest and most constant relationship of his life, more intimate than his relationship with any human being, more demanding than his relationship with his own body, and it was this absolute identification of the man with the garment that gave the white mantle its unique power, and that made its loss, when it came, a trauma from which many knights never fully recovered. The relationship between the white mantle and the armor that it covered was a practical and symbolic symbiosis that transformed the knight into a living icon of the fusion of the martial and the monastic that was the distinctive charism of the Templar order. The mantle was worn over the hauberk, the coat of mail that was the knight's primary defense against the arrows and the swords of the enemy, and the white wool served to protect the metal rings from the direct heat of the sun, which could otherwise make the mail unbearably hot to the touch and could even, in the extreme conditions of the Syrian summer, cause burns on the knight's skin beneath the padded gambeson. The mantle also served to conceal the glitter of the mail from the eyes of the enemy, a tactical advantage that the Templars exploited in their favored tactic of the ambush. A squadron of knights, their white mantles drawn over their mail and their helmets covered with white linen covers, could lie in wait behind a ridge or in a wadi, invisible against the pale limestone of the landscape, until the Saracen army was close enough for the devastating charge that would shatter the enemy line before it could form up to receive the attack. The combination of the white wool and the steel mail created a visual effect that was both beautiful and terrifying. The soft, flowing lines of the mantle, with its deep folds and its gentle billowing in the wind, contrasted with the hard, angular lines of the mail beneath, a contrast that was, in the aesthetic language of the Middle Ages, a representation of the union of the active and the contemplative. The sword and the censer, the lion and the lamb, that was the essence of the Templar vocation. The mantle, in its protective function, was also a shroud in waiting. The knight who fell in battle was buried in his mantle, the same garment that had covered his armor in life now wrapping his body in death. The red cross that had blazed on his breast in the charge now the only color on the white bundle that was lowered into the earth. The rule's instruction that the knight was to sleep in his mantle, or at least with the mantle folded at the foot of his bed, was a constant reminder of this mortuary function of the garment. Every night, when the knight removed his mantle and laid it at his feet, he was rehearsing his own death, practicing the gesture of laying aside the garment that he would one day lay aside for the last time. When the master or the chaplain would fold the white wool around his cold body and commit him to the earth from which he had come. The white mantle, in this sense, was a garment that belonged to death as much as to life, a cloth that was woven from the wool of the lambs that were slaughtered for the table and that would return, in the end, to the earth from which the lambs had grazed their grass. A cycle of life and death and resurrection that was the deep structure of the Templar spirituality, and that found its perfect expression in the white wool that covered the knight from the day of his profession to the day of his burial. The white mantle's interaction with the climate of the Holy Land was a constant theme in the writings of the Templar chroniclers and the observations of outside commentators, who marveled at the ability of the knights to wear their heavy woolen garments in the ferocious heat of the Syrian summer without collapsing from heat stroke or dehydration. The secret, as we have already noted, was the reflective property of the undyed wool, which scattered the sun's radiation rather than absorbing it. But the Templars also developed a series of supplementary practices that enhanced the cooling effect of the mantle and that were codified in the rule and the retrice. The knight was instructed to soak his mantle in water before a long march, a practice that transformed the wool into a primitive evaporative cooling system. As the water evaporated from the fabric, it drew heat from the knight's body and from the mail beneath, creating a microclimate of relative coolness that could last for several hours in the dry desert air. The mantle was also worn loosely, with the front open and the hood thrown back, to allow the maximum circulation of air around the body, and the rule explicitly permits the knight to unfasten the leather thong at the neck during the hottest part of the day, a concession to practicality that was one of the few areas in which the otherwise inflexible dress code allowed for any variation. The chronicler of the Fifth Crusade, Oliver of Paderborn, who spent several months with the Templar contingent during the siege of Damietta in 1219, recorded his astonishment at the hardiness of the white-clad knights. "I have seen them march for 10 hours in the heat of the Egyptian sun, their mantles white with the salt of their sweat, and yet they did not complain, and they did not falter, and when the enemy appeared at the end of the day, they charged as fresh as though they had just risen from their beds." Truly, the mantle of the temple is a garment of miracles, for it turns the fire of the sun into the coolness of the shade, and it gives to the wearer the strength of the angels. The Muslim enemies of the order, who were themselves masters of desert warfare and who understood the physiological challenges of fighting in armor under the sun, were deeply impressed by the Templars' apparent immunity to the heat, and the chronicler Baha ad-Din, Saladin's biographer, speculated that the white mantle was made from a fabric that had been enchanted by Christian sorcerers. A belief that added another layer of superstitious dread to the terror that the Templar uniform inspired. The white mantle, in this climatic dimension, was a technological marvel of its age, a piece of military equipment that used the simple principles of physics and physiology to give the Templar knight a decisive advantage over his enemies in the most unforgiving environment on earth. And the fact that this technology was disguised as a garment of religious significance only added to its effectiveness. Because the enemy who saw the white wool and the red cross was looking at a symbol, not at a weapon, and he never understood that the symbol was itself the weapon, a cloth that killed as surely as the sword that was hidden beneath its folds. The white mantle's role in the disciplinary system of the order was as a marker of status that could be withdrawn as the ultimate sanction short of expulsion, a penalty that was known as the loss of the habit, and that was inflicted for the most serious offenses that did not merit the final, irrevocable separation from the temple. The knight who was sentenced to the loss of the habit was required to stand before the assembled chapter, to remove his white mantle with his own hands, and to hand it to the master, who then gave him a brown or black mantle in its place, a garment that marked him as a degraded being who had forfeited the privilege of the white wool and who was now reduced to the status of a penitent. a man who was still a brother of the temple, but who was no longer a knight in the full sense of the word. The psychological impact of this sentence was devastating. The knight who had worn the white mantle for years, who had wrapped himself in it every morning and every night, who had charged into battle with the red cross blazing on his breast, was suddenly stripped of the garment that had become his identity and was forced to wear the dark cloth of the sergeants. A cloth that proclaimed to every observer that he was a sinner who had fallen from grace, and who was now in a state of penance that might last for years, or for the rest of his life. The loss of the habit was accompanied by a comprehensive regime of humiliation and deprivation. The penitent was required to eat on the floor of the refectory, to sleep without a mattress, to perform the most menial labor of the house, and to kneel at the door of the chapter house every Sunday, begging for the prayers of the brothers who had once been his equals and who now passed him by without a word. The brown mantle that the penitent wore was a constant, visible reminder of his fallen state, a garment that proclaimed his shame to the world and that made him, in the eyes of the order, a living sermon on the wages of sin. The restoration of the white mantle, when it eventually came, was a ritual of reconciliation that was as emotionally charged as the original investiture. The penitent was brought into the chapter house, the brown mantle was removed, and the white wool was once again placed on his shoulders by the master, who spoke the words of absolution and welcomed the brother back into the full fellowship of the temple. The entire cycle of the loss and restoration of the habit was a powerful instrument of social control, a drama of degradation and redemption that reinforced the sacred value of the white mantle and reminded every knight, every day, that the garment he wore was not a possession but a privilege. A gift that could be taken away at any moment if the purity it symbolized was compromised by the sins of the flesh or the rebellion of the will. The white mantle as a garment of protection in the literal, physical sense was a function that has often been underestimated by modern historians, who have tended to focus on the symbolic dimensions of the uniform at the expense of its practical utility on the battlefield. The heavy woolen fabric of the mantle, which was woven to a thickness that a modern tailor would classify as coat weight, or even blanket weight, provided a significant measure of protection against the cuts and slashes of edged weapons, particularly the curved sabers that were the favored arm of the Saracen light cavalry. A blow from a saber that might have sliced through a linen surcoat and cut into the mail beneath was often deflected or blunted by the thick wool of the Templar mantle, which absorbed some of the energy of the strike and reduced the depth of the wound. The mantle also provided a measure of protection against the arrows that were the most common cause of casualties in medieval warfare. An arrow that struck the mantle at an oblique angle was often deflected by the wool fibers, which acted as a primitive form of textile armor. And even an arrow that penetrated the mantle and the mail beneath was often slowed enough by the wool that it did not penetrate as deeply into the flesh as it would have done if the knight had been wearing only a linen surcoat. The Templar chronicles contain several accounts of knights whose lives were saved by their mantles. Brother Gerard de Rifort, the future master of the temple, was struck by an arrow at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177 that penetrated his mantle and his mail but stopped just short of his heart, a wound that he survived and that he attributed, in his own account, to the protection of the white wool that covered his breast. The mantle was also used as an improvised weapon in the desperate chaos of close-quarter combat. A knight who had lost his sword could throw his mantle over the head of an enemy, blinding him and tangling his arms, and then dispatch him with a dagger or simply drag him from his horse and trample him underfoot. The rule does not prescribe this use of the mantle, but the tactical manuals that circulated among the Templar commanders in the 13th century included among the techniques that the knights were to master in their training, a recognition that the mantle was, in the final analysis, a piece of military equipment as well as a sacred garment, and that its utility on the battlefield was as important as its symbolism in the chapel. The white mantle, in this practical dimension, was the perfect expression of the Templar genius for combining the spiritual and the material, the heavenly and the earthly, the sign and the thing signified, into a single object that served the needs of the body and the needs of the soul with equal efficiency and that could, in the hands of a trained knight, be the difference between life and death, victory and defeat, salvation and damnation. The white mantle's role in the economy of the Templar order extended beyond its function as a garment, and into the realm of finance and accounting, where the woolen cloth became a unit of value that was tracked, recorded, and audited with the same meticulous precision that the order applied to its gold and its silver. The draper's accounts, which have survived in fragments from several preceptories, reveal that the cost of a single white mantle, including the wool, the weaving, the fulling, the sewing, and the embroidery of the Red Cross, was approximately 40 silver sous tournois in the late 13th century, a sum that was roughly equivalent to the annual rent of a small farm in the Ile-de-France. The total cost of clothing the approximately 600 knights who were in the field at any given time was therefore a substantial line item in the order's budget, and the treasurers of the temple kept a close eye on the draper's expenditures, demanding regular reports and imposing strict limits on the number of mantles that could be issued in a given year. The mantles were considered to be the property of the order, not of the individual knight, and the rule explicitly forbids any brother from selling, giving away, or bequeathing his mantle, which was to be returned to the draper upon the knight's death or departure from the house. This prohibition extended to the knight's family. A mother who requested a lock of her son's hair or a piece of his mantle as a relic was to be refused, because the mantle belonged to the temple and its wool could not be dispersed into the secular world. The mantle's status as a corporate asset gave it a legal standing that was unique among medieval garments. The theft of a Templar mantle was not treated as a simple theft but as a sacrilege, a crime that was tried in the ecclesiastical courts, and that could carry a penalty of excommunication in addition to the secular punishment of imprisonment or fine. The 1243 cartulary of the Preceptory of Ponferrada records the case of a Spanish knight named Rodrigo de Tordesillas who was caught attempting to sell a Templar mantle to a Jewish merchant of Burgos. The merchant, who had no idea of the garment's provenance, was released with a warning, but Rodrigo was tried by the chapter, found guilty of the sacrilegious alienation of the order's property, and sentenced to the loss of the habit and permanent imprisonment in the dungeon of the castle of Monzon. A sentence that was approved by the Master of Spain and that was carried out with the full solemnity of the Templar penal ritual. The white mantle, in this legal and economic dimension, was a piece of property that was invested with a sacred character, a thing that belonged to God and that could not be bought, sold, or stolen without committing a sin that cried to heaven for vengeance, and the knights who wore it were, in the eyes of the order's lawyers, merely the custodians of a garment that was ultimately the property of Christ and of the Virgin, to whom the temple was dedicated. The white mantle as a subject of artistic representation in the medieval visual arts provides a fascinating window into the way the Templar uniform was perceived by the wider culture of Western Europe, a perception that was often quite different from the order's own self-understanding and that reveals the tensions and the ambivalences that surrounded the military orders in the centuries before their suppression. The Templars appear in the sculpture of the great cathedrals of the 12th and 13th centuries, most famously in the archivolt of the north portal of Chartres, where a pair of knights in flowing mantles, their red crosses still faintly visible beneath the patina of centuries, flank the figure of the Virgin as guardians of the Holy House. In these sculptures, the Templar mantle is depicted with an attention to detail that suggests the sculptors were working from direct observation. The folds of the wool, the position of the cross, the way the mantle falls over the mail, are all rendered with a fidelity that makes the stones seem to breathe. The Templars also appear in the illuminated manuscripts that were produced in the scriptoria of the monasteries, often in the margins of psalters and books of hours, where the white-clad knights are shown charging into battle against dragons, demons, and Saracens, their mantles billowing behind them like the wings of angels, their red crosses glowing like drops of blood on the white parchment. These illuminations, which were made for the devotional use of lay patrons who were often sympathetic to the crusading movement, present the Templar mantle as a garment of pure, uncomplicated heroism, a cloth that marks the wearer as a soldier of Christ and that guarantees his victory over the forces of darkness. But there is another tradition of Templar imagery that is darker and more ambivalent, a tradition that emerges in the 13th century and that reflects the growing unease of the secular clergy and the secular nobility with the power and the privileges of the military orders. In the sculptures of the Cathedral of Reims, a series of small reliefs that are known as the Calendar of the Templars depict the knights engaged in activities that are, at best, morally ambiguous, counting money, negotiating with Saracens, and in one notorious panel, whipping a penitent with a severity that seems to border on the sadistic. The white mantle in these reliefs is not a garment of angelic purity but a mask that conceals a corrupt and violent reality. A cloth that is white on the outside but black on the inside, a symbol of the hypocrisy that the order's enemies were beginning to attribute to the brothers who wore it. The visual record of the Templar mantle is thus a record of the divided consciousness of the medieval West, a consciousness that was capable of seeing the same white wool as the garment of a saint or the garment of a sinner, depending on the angle of the light and the prejudices of the viewer, and this ambiguity is itself a testament to the power of the uniform to concentrate and to amplify the hopes and the fears, the faith and the doubt, that were the twin poles of the medieval imagination. The white mantle's relationship to the Templar vow of poverty was a paradox that the order never fully resolved, a paradox that was inscribed in the very fabric of the garment, and that haunted the conscience of the more reflective brothers throughout the history of the temple. The vow of poverty, which was the first of the 3 monastic vows that every Templar pronounced, required the knight to renounce all personal property and to live in a state of complete dependence on the community, a state that was symbolized, in the monastic tradition, by the common clothing that was distributed to all the brothers without regard to their former wealth or status. The white mantle's role in the psychological warfare that the Templars waged against their enemies was perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of the uniform's military effectiveness, a dimension that operated at the level of the subconscious and the irrational, where the sight of the white-clad knights triggered ancient fears and associations that the rationalistic military science of the medieval Islamic world was powerless to counteract. The color white, in the symbolic universe of the medieval Near East, was associated with a range of meanings that were quite different from the European associations of purity and innocence. White was the color of the shroud, the garment of the dead. White was the color of the jinn, the uncanny beings of smokeless fire that haunted the deserts and the ruins. White was the color of the plague, the pale pustules that broke out on the skin of the afflicted and that signified the approach of death. The Templars, who had adopted the white mantle as a symbol of their own theological preoccupations, were probably unaware of the full range of these associations, but they were acutely aware of the effect that their uniform had on the Saracen soldiers who faced them across the battlefield, an effect that was described by every chronicler of the Crusades, Christian and Muslim alike, as a peculiar terror that seemed to grip the enemy even before the first charge was launched. The Templar commanders exploited this terror with a tactical sophistication that suggests a deep understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. They would often arrange their squadrons so that the white mantles were concentrated in the center of the line, where they would be most visible to the enemy, while the darker-clad sergeants and the Turco-Pole auxiliaries were placed on the flanks, creating a visual contrast that made the white center seem even brighter and more menacing. The charge, when it came, was preceded by a period of stillness that was almost as terrifying as the charge itself. The white-clad knights would sit motionless on their horses, their lances resting on their stirrups, their mantles hanging in heavy folds, their faces invisible behind their helmets, a tableau of silent menace that seemed to the waiting Saracens like a vision of the dead rising from their graves to take vengeance on the living. The psychological pressure of this stillness was so intense that the Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir records several instances in which Saracen units broke and fled before the Templars had even moved, as though they were fleeing not from men but from the angels of death. The white mantle, in this psychological warfare, was a weapon that required no edge and no point, a weapon that killed with the eyes and not with the hands, and the Templars wielded it with an artistry that turned the battlefield into a theater of terror in which the white-clad knights were the protagonists of a drama that the enemy was doomed to lose, not because they were outnumbered or outmatched, but because their imaginations had been conquered before their bodies were touched. The white mantle's role in the internal cohesion of the Templar order was a function that went beyond the merely symbolic and into the realm of the neurological, a function that modern psychology would recognize as the creation of a shared identity through the mechanism of visual uniformity. The human brain is wired to respond to visual cues of group membership with a surge of oxytocin, the hormone of bonding and trust, and the Templars, by clothing themselves in identical white mantles, were creating a constant, low-level neurochemical reinforcement of the fraternal bond that was the foundation of their military effectiveness. The knight who saw a white mantle in his peripheral vision during a charge knew, without having to think, that the man in that mantle was a brother, a member of the same sacred corporation, a man who would die for him and for whom he would die, and this knowledge operated at a level that was faster than conscious thought. A level of instinct and reflex that allowed the Templar squadron to function as a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. The uniformity of the white mantle also eliminated the cognitive load that was imposed on the secular knight, who had to process a constant stream of visual information about the identities and the affiliations of the men around him, the coat of arms of this lord, the badge of that company, the colors of this faction, all of which had to be recognized and interpreted in real time. A task that consumed mental resources that could otherwise have been devoted to the business of fighting. The Templar, by contrast, was freed from this cognitive burden. Every man in white was a brother, every man not in white was an enemy, and the simplicity of this binary classification allowed the knight to focus his entire attention on the task of killing, without the distraction of having to sort the visual chaos of the battlefield into friend and foe. The military effectiveness of this cognitive simplification was demonstrated, in negative terms, by the experience of the secular armies that attempted to fight the Saracens without the benefit of a uniform. The chronicles are filled with accounts of secular knights who were killed by their own allies in the confusion of a melee, or who hesitated at a crucial moment because they were not sure whether the horsemen approaching through the dust were friends or enemies. The Templars, in their white mantles, never had this problem. The white wool was a beacon of certainty in the fog of war, a visual anchor that held the line together, and that allowed the order to execute the complex maneuvers of a cavalry charge with a precision that was unmatched by any other force on the medieval battlefield. The white mantle, in this neurological dimension, was a technology of group cognition, a tool that harnessed the brain's innate response to visual uniformity to create a fighting force that was, in the literal sense, greater than the sum of its parts, a collective intelligence that moved and fought and killed as one, a single white body with 1,000 swords and a single will. The white mantle's place in the broader history of military uniforms is a subject that has fascinated historians of dress and historians of warfare alike, because the Templar uniform was, in many respects, the first true uniform in the modern sense of the word, a garment that was deliberately designed to erase individuality and to promote cohesion. And that was imposed from above by a central authority rather than evolving organically from the preferences of the individual soldiers. The armies of antiquity had worn uniforms of a sort. The Roman legionary was recognizable by his tunic and his segmented armor, the Greek hoplite by his bronze breastplate and his crested helmet, and the soldiers of the Chinese warring states by their standardized lamellar armor and their colored plumes. But these ancient uniforms were primarily a function of state-organized logistics and mass production, and they lacked the ideological charge that the Templar mantle carried, the sense that the garment was not merely a piece of equipment, but a proclamation of a sacred identity. A banner that the soldier wore on his body as a sign of his membership in a community of faith, and his commitment to a cause that was literally cosmic in its significance. The Templar uniform was, in this sense, the ancestor of the uniforms of the modern era, from the red coats of the British Army that were introduced in the 17th century to the field grey of the German Army that was adopted in the 19th, all of which were designed to create a visual solidarity that would hold the soldiers together in the face of the terrors of the battlefield. The specific influence of the Templar mantle on the development of the military uniform can be traced through the military orders that succeeded the Temple, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, and the Spanish orders of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara all adopted uniforms that were based on the Templar model of the white mantle with a distinctive cross. Though each order modified the basic design to reflect its own identity, creating a family of white-clad military orders that dominated the battlefields of the Crusades and the Reconquista for nearly 3 centuries. The influence of the Templar mantle extended even beyond the military orders and into the secular armies of the late Middle Ages, particularly the Swiss pikemen and the German Landsknecht, who adopted a form of uniform dress that was intended to create a corporate identity and to intimidate the enemy, a practice that was directly inspired, through the mediation of the military orders, by the example of the white-clad knights who had ridden out of the Temple of Jerusalem to conquer the infidel, and to defend the Holy Land. The white mantle's role in the hagiography of the Templar order, the body of saints' lives and miracle stories that grew up around the martyrs of the Temple in the centuries after the order's suppression, was a crucial factor in the survival of the Templar legend and in the transformation of the white wool into a relic that was sought after by the faithful long after the last knight had died on the pyre. The Templar martyrs who were celebrated in the popular piety of the late Middle Ages were almost invariably described as dying in their white mantles, the red cross blazing on their breasts as they were cut down by the Saracens or burned by the Inquisition, and the mantle itself was credited with miraculous powers. It was said that the mantles of the martyred Templars would not burn, that the red crosses would glow with an unearthly light in the darkness, and that the touch of a martyr's mantle could heal the sick and cast out demons. These stories, which were collected by the 14th century chronicler Jean de Joinville and by the anonymous author of the Miracula Templarium, circulated widely in the popular culture of the late medieval period, and they contributed to the aura of sanctity that clung to the memory of the order long after the official church had condemned the Templars as heretics and had suppressed their name. The white mantle, in these miracle stories, had become a relic in its own right, a piece of cloth that had been sanctified by the blood of the martyrs and that carried within its fibers the power of the faith that the martyrs had died for. The cult of the Templar mantle was particularly strong in the regions of France and Spain where the order had been most deeply rooted, and the records of the diocesan Inquisition courts contain several cases from the late 14th and early 15th centuries in which lay people were accused of venerating pieces of white wool that they claimed had come from the mantles of the Templar saints. A practice that the inquisitors condemned as superstitious but that the people persisted in nonetheless because the white wool was, for them, the last tangible link to the lost world of the temple, a world that had been destroyed by the greed of kings and the cowardice of popes but that lived on in the imagination of the faithful, a white flame that the winds of persecution could not extinguish. The white mantle's legacy in the material culture of the modern world can be traced in a surprising variety of institutions and traditions, from the ceremonial robes of the modern judiciary to the white uniforms of the papal Swiss Guard, from the white coats of the medical profession to the white dresses of the brides who walk down the aisles of Christian churches. The connection between the Templar mantle and the white wedding dress is particularly suggestive. The medieval church, drawing on the same baptismal symbolism that had inspired the Templar uniform, had long associated the color white with the purity of the bride of Christ, and this association was transferred, in the later Middle Ages, to the brides of mortal men, who began to wear white on their wedding days as a sign of their chastity and their commitment to the new life that they were entering. The white mantle of the Templar knight, who was himself a bride of Christ in the mystical theology of the order, was a direct precursor of the white wedding dress, and the two garments share a common symbolic vocabulary of purity, sacrifice, and the renunciation of the old self for the sake of the new identity that is received through the sacrament. The white uniforms of the medical profession, which were introduced in the 19th century at the urging of the pioneer of antiseptic surgery Joseph Lister, also draw, however distantly, on the Templar tradition. The white coat was chosen as a symbol of cleanliness and purity, a garment that proclaimed the doctor's commitment to the fight against the invisible enemies of disease and infection, a fight that was, in its own way, as heroic and as sacred as the Templars' fight against the visible enemies of the cross. The white mantle of the temple, in this long historical perspective, has never really disappeared. It has changed its form and its function, migrating from the battlefield to the hospital, from the chapter house to the courtroom, from the convent to the laboratory. But it has always retained its essential character as a garment of transformation, a cloth that marks the wearer as set apart for a special purpose. A uniform that erases the individual self in the service of a higher calling. Whether that calling is the defense of the Holy Land, the healing of the sick, or the pursuit of justice and truth. The white wool that was first woven in the sheep pastures of Yorkshire and the flax fields of the Nile Delta has become, in the course of a millennium, the white cotton and the white polyester and the white silk of 1,000 different professions and 1,000 different ceremonies. But the ghost of the Templar mantle still haunts every white garment that is worn as a sign of identity and a badge of service. A reminder that the simplest piece of cloth can carry a weight of meaning that no amount of time can erase. The white mantle's role in the construction of masculine identity in the Middle Ages is a subject that has attracted increasing attention from gender historians, who have recognized in the Templar uniform a complex and often contradictory negotiation of the demands of the knightly and the monastic, the martial and the celibate, the active and the contemplative. That were the twin poles of the medieval ideal of manhood. The secular knight's identity was built upon a performance of masculinity that was fundamentally sexualized. The knight fought for the favor of a lady, he displayed his coat of arms as a sign of his lineage and his virility, and he expected the rewards of his valor to include the love of women and the fathering of sons who would carry on his name. The Templars' white mantle repudiated this entire economy of masculine display. The knight who wore the white wool was declaring himself to be a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven, a man who had renounced the love of women and the pride of lineage and the hope of heirs, a man whose only offspring would be the spiritual children of his prayers and the martyr's crowns that he hoped to win. The white mantle was, in this sense, a garment of anti-masculinity, a cloth that negated the very qualities that the secular culture of chivalry most prized, and the secular nobility, who understood this negation perfectly, regarded the Templar uniform with a mixture of contempt and fear that is palpable in the literature of the 12th and 13th centuries. The troubadour Marcabrew, in a famous servant that attacks the military orders, sneers at the Templars as men who have exchanged their swords for distaffs and their ladies for the Virgin, and who wear the white mantle of the women who spin the wool. The insult, which equates the white mantle with feminine domesticity, reveals the deep anxiety that the Templar uniform provoked in a culture that had made the performance of aggressive masculinity the center of its identity. But the Templars themselves, far from being embarrassed by the association of their garment with femininity, embraced it as a theological truth. The white mantle was the garment of the bride of Christ, and the knight who wore it was, in the eyes of God, a woman, a soul who had been impregnated by the Holy Spirit and who would bring forth the fruits of charity and obedience. This gender fluidity, which seems so modern and so radical, was in fact deeply rooted in the Christian mystical tradition, from St. Paul's declaration that in Christ there is neither male nor female to the bridal theology of the Cistercians that had nourished the early Templar charism. The white mantle, in this gender perspective, was a garment that transcended the categories of the world, a cloth that made the knight neither male nor female but a new creature, a citizen of the heavenly Jerusalem where the only identity that mattered was the identity of the redeemed, and the only garment that was worn was the white robe of the saints who had washed their garments in the blood of the Lamb. The white mantle's relationship to the sacred geography of the Holy Land was a dimension of the uniform's meaning that was particularly vivid for the knights who served in the East, where the white wool became a medium of connection to the holy places that were the object of the order's devotion and the scene of its battles. The knight who knelt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the very spot where the body of Christ had lain in the tomb, was kneeling on the stone that had been touched by the sacred flesh, and the white mantle that covered his shoulders was, in his understanding, a participation in the white linen shroud that had wrapped the body of the Lord. The knight who rode out from the Temple Mount, the site of Solomon's original temple and the place where the order had its first headquarters, was riding out from the navel of the world, the point where heaven and earth met, and the white wool that billowed behind him was a cloud of glory that connected him to the Shekinah, the visible presence of God that had once filled the Holy of Holies. The geography of the Holy Land was saturated with the color white, the limestone hills of Judea, the whitewashed villages of the coastal plain, the salt-encrusted shores of the Dead Sea, all of which formed a visual context in which the white mantle was not a foreign intrusion but a natural element, a piece of the landscape that moved and fought and prayed. A human embodiment of the holy whiteness that was the color of the land itself. The white mantle's role in the construction of masculine identity in the Middle Ages is a subject that has attracted increasing attention from gender historians, who have recognized in the Templar uniform a complex and often contradictory negotiation of the demands of the knightly and the monastic, the martial and the celibate, the active and the contemplative. That were the twin poles of the medieval ideal of manhood. The secular knight's identity was built upon a performance of masculinity that was fundamentally sexualized. The knight fought for the favor of a lady, he displayed his coat of arms as a sign of his lineage and his virility, and he expected the rewards of his valor to include the love of women and the fathering of sons who would carry on his name. The Templars' white mantle repudiated this entire economy of masculine display. The knight who wore the white wool was declaring himself to be a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven, a man who had renounced the love of women and the pride of lineage and the hope of heirs, a man whose only offspring would be the spiritual children of his prayers and the martyr's crowns that he hoped to win. The white mantle was, in this sense, a garment of anti-masculinity, a cloth that negated the very qualities that the secular culture of chivalry most prized, and the secular nobility, who understood this negation perfectly, regarded the Templar uniform with a mixture of contempt and fear that is palpable in the literature of the 12th and 13th centuries. The troubadour Marcabreau, in a famous servant that attacks the military orders, sneers at the Templars as men who have exchanged their swords for distaffs and their ladies for the Virgin, and who wear the white mantle of the women who spin the wool. The insult, which equates the white mantle with feminine domesticity, reveals the deep anxiety that the Templar uniform provoked in a culture that had made the performance of aggressive masculinity the center of its identity. But the Templars themselves, far from being embarrassed by the association of their garment with femininity, embraced it as a theological truth. The white mantle was the garment of the bride of Christ, and the knight who wore it was, in the eyes of God, a woman, a soul who had been impregnated by the Holy Spirit and who would bring forth the fruits of charity and obedience. This gender fluidity, which seems so modern and so radical, was in fact deeply rooted in the Christian mystical tradition, from St. Paul's declaration that in Christ there is neither male nor female to the bridal theology of the Cistercians that had nourished the early Templar charism. The white mantle, in this gender perspective, was a garment that transcended the categories of the world, a cloth that made the knight neither male nor female but a new creature, a citizen of the heavenly Jerusalem where the only identity that mattered was the identity of the redeemed, and the only garment that was worn was the white robe of the saints who had washed their garments in the blood of the Lamb. The white mantle's relationship to the sacred geography of the Holy Land was a dimension of the uniform's meaning that was particularly vivid for the knights who served in the East, where the white wool became a medium of connection to the holy places that were the object of the order's devotion and the scene of its battles. The knight who knelt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the very spot where the body of Christ had lain in the tomb, was kneeling on the stone that had been touched by the sacred flesh, and the white mantle that covered his shoulders was, in his understanding, a participation in the white linen shroud that had wrapped the body of the Lord. The knight who rode out from the Temple Mount, the site of Solomon's original temple and the place where the order had its first headquarters, was riding out from the navel of the world, the point where heaven and earth met, and the white wool that billowed behind him was a cloud of glory that connected him to the Shekinah, the visible presence of God that had once filled the Holy of Holies. The geography of the Holy Land was saturated with the color white: the limestone hills of Judea, the whitewashed villages of the coastal plain, the salt-encrusted shores of the Dead Sea, all of which formed a visual context in which the white mantle was not a foreign intrusion but a natural element, a piece of the landscape that moved and fought and prayed. A human embodiment of the holy whiteness that was the color of the land itself. The Templars who served in the East were deeply conscious of this geographical dimension of their uniform, and the letters that they wrote to their brothers in the European preceptories are filled with expressions of longing for the white hills and the white cities and the white light of the Holy Land, a light that was different from the gray light of the north, a light that bathed the white mantle in a radiance that was, they believed, a foretaste of the uncreated light of heaven. The white mantle, in this geographical context, was a garment of pilgrimage, a cloth that the knight had carried with him from his home in the west to the place where Christ had lived and died and risen, and that he would carry back, God willing, to his home in the west when his time of service was done, a souvenir of the holy that would, in the gray light of the European winter, remind him of the white hills of Judea and the white walls of Jerusalem, and the white light of the land that he had sworn to defend with his blood. The white mantle's final chapter, the chapter that was written in the flames of the pyres of Paris and in the dungeons of the French crown, is the most tragic and the most revealing of all the episodes in the long history of the Templar uniform, a history that ended, as it had begun, with a stripping and a dressing, a removal and an investiture. But this time the garment that was removed was the garment of salvation, and the garment that was put on was the garment of condemnation. The arrests of October 13, 1307, were followed by the immediate confiscation of the Templar mantles, which were collected by the bailiffs of the king and inventoried with the same meticulousness that the Templar drapers had once applied to their own stores. The mantles were examined for hidden symbols, for secret marks, for any evidence that might support the lurid accusations of heresy and idolatry that the royal propagandists had spread through the kingdom. The crosses were scrutinized for signs of desecration, the wool was searched for traces of the idols that the Templars were supposed to worship, and the white cloth that had once been the emblem of the purest knighthood in Christendom was subjected to a forensic examination that treated it as the evidence of a crime, the corpus delicti of a conspiracy against the faith. The knights who had worn the white mantles were stripped of their garments and cast into the dungeons, where they were tortured into confessing the crimes that the king's lawyers had invented, and the mantles themselves were stored in the vaults of the Temple of Paris, where they lay in the darkness, the red crosses fading, the white wool yellowing with age, until the final suppression of the order in 1312. When the remaining mantles were burned in a public auto-da-fe, the flames consuming the wool and the linen and the red crosses and the centuries of history and prayer and blood that the fabric had absorbed. The white mantle, which had been born in the flame of the Holy Spirit at the Council of Troyes in 1129, died in the flames of the Inquisition in 1314, and the symmetry of this death is a fitting end to the story of a garment that had always been, in the deepest sense, a garment of sacrifice, a cloth that was destined to be burned, whether on the altar of the battlefield or on the pyre of the persecutor. A holocaust of wool that rose to heaven as a sweet-smelling savor, a prayer visible to the angels and acceptable to the God who had once wrapped himself in the white linen of the Incarnation and who would, at the end of time, wrap the elect in the white robes of the resurrection. The Templars who served in the East were deeply conscious of this geographical dimension of their uniform, and the letters that they wrote to their brothers in the European preceptories are filled with expressions of longing for the white hills and the white cities and the white light of the Holy Land, a light that was different from the grey light of the north, a light that bathed the white mantle in a radiance that was, they believed, a foretaste of the uncreated light of heaven. The white mantle, in this geographical context, was a garment of pilgrimage, a cloth that the knight had carried with him from his home in the west to the place where Christ had lived and died and risen, and that he would carry back, God willing, to his home in the west when his time of service was done, a souvenir of the holy that would, in the grey light of the European winter, remind him of the white hills of Judea and the white walls of Jerusalem, and the white light of the land that he had sworn to defend with his blood. The white mantle's final chapter, the chapter that was written in the flames of the pyres of Paris and in the dungeons of the French crown, is the most tragic and the most revealing of all the episodes in the long history of the Templar uniform, a history that ended, as it had begun, with a stripping and a dressing, a removal and an investiture. But this time the garment that was removed was the garment of salvation, and the garment that was put on was the garment of condemnation. The arrests of October 13, 1307, were followed by the immediate confiscation of the Templar mantles, which were collected by the bailiffs of the king and inventory with the same meticulousness that the Templar drapers had once applied to their own stores. The mantles were examined for hidden symbols, for secret marks, for any evidence that might support the lurid accusations of heresy and idolatry that the royal propagandists had spread through the kingdom. The crosses were scrutinized for signs of desecration, the wool was searched for traces of the idols that the Templars were supposed to worship, and the white cloth that had once been the emblem of the purest knighthood in Christendom was subjected to a forensic examination that treated it as the evidence of a crime, the corpus delicti of a conspiracy against the faith. The knights who had worn the white mantles were stripped of their garments and cast into the dungeons, where they were tortured into confessing the crimes that the king's lawyers had invented, and the mantles themselves were stored in the vaults of the Temple of Paris, where they lay in the darkness, the red crosses fading, the white wool yellowing with age, until the final suppression of the order in 1312. When the remaining mantles were burned in a public auto-da-fe, the flames consuming the wool and the linen and the red crosses and the centuries of history and prayer and blood that the fabric had absorbed. The white mantle, which had been born in the flame of the Holy Spirit at the Council of Troyes in 1129, died in the flames of the Inquisition in 1314, and the symmetry of this death is a fitting end to the story of a garment that had always been, in the deepest sense, a garment of sacrifice, a cloth that was destined to be burned, whether on the altar of the battlefield or on the pyre of the persecutor. A holocaust of wool that rose to heaven as a sweet-smelling savor, a prayer visible to the angels and acceptable to the God who had once wrapped himself in the white linen of the Incarnation and who would, at the end of time, wrap the elect in the white robes of the resurrection. The white mantle's afterlife in the mythology and the popular culture of the centuries that followed the suppression of the Templar order is a testament to the enduring power of the garment as a symbol, a power that was not diminished but actually enhanced by the tragedy of the order's destruction. The white mantle became, in the imagination of the West, a garment of mystery and of longing, a cloth that was associated with the lost golden age of chivalry, with the hidden treasure of the Templars, and with the secret knowledge that the order was supposed to have possessed and that it had taken with it to the grave. The legends of the Templar treasure, which proliferated from the 14th century onward, almost invariably described the treasure as being guarded by knights in white mantles, a spectral guard that had survived the flames and that continued to protect the order's secrets in some hidden location, whether the depths of the Temple Mount, the crypts of Rosslyn Chapel, or the caves of the Pyrenees. The white mantle, in these legends, was the uniform of a ghost army, a phantom garrison that would one day return to restore the temple to its former glory and to punish the kings and the popes who had destroyed it. The Freemasons, who began to incorporate Templar symbolism into their rituals in the 18th century, adopted the white mantle as one of the central regalia of the higher degrees. A garment that was worn during the initiation ceremonies of the Knights Templar degree and that was understood to represent the purity of the Masonic ideal and the continuity of the ancient wisdom that the Templars had preserved and transmitted to the modern world. The white mantle of the Masonic Templar is, of course, a very different garment from the white mantle of the historical Templar. It is made of silk or satin rather than wool, it is adorned with elaborate embroidery and jewels, and it is worn for a few hours in a candlelit lodge rather than for a lifetime in the heat of the Syrian sun. But the symbolic genealogy is clear, and the Masonic appropriation of the white mantle is a measure of the garment's enduring prestige, a prestige that has survived every attempt to discredit or to forget the order that first wore it. The white mantle, in the popular culture of the modern era, has become a costume, a piece of theatrical dress that is donned by the actors in the movies and the television shows that retell the Templar story, and that is sold in the souvenir shops of the tourist sites that claim a connection to the order. The garment that was once the most sacred object in the life of the Knight of the Temple has become, in the 21st century, a Halloween costume, a piece of polyester that is worn by children who have never heard of the Council of Troyes or the Battle of La Fourbe or the Pyres of Paris, but who know, with the instinct of the culture that has inherited the visual legacy of the Templars, that the white mantle and the red cross are the signs of something mysterious and powerful and ancient, something that belongs to a world that is lost but not forgotten, a world that the white wool still summons, however faintly, whenever it is seen. The white mantle's place in the history of Western art, from the medieval illuminations to the Romantic paintings of the 19th century, is a record of the changing ways in which the Templar uniform has been imagined and reimagined by the artists who have been drawn to its visual power and its symbolic density. The medieval illuminators, as we have seen, depicted the Templar mantle with a documentary realism that suggests a familiarity with the actual garment, but the artists of the Renaissance, who lived in a world that had forgotten the Templars or that remembered them only as heretics, rarely included the white mantle in their paintings of the Crusades, preferring to dress their crusading knights in the armor and the heraldic colors of their own time. It was the Romantics of the early 19th century who rediscovered the Templars and who made the white mantle into an object of artistic fascination, a garment that was perfectly suited to the Romantic sensibility with its love of the medieval, the mysterious, and the macabre. The French painter François-Marius Granit, who exhibited his interior of a Templar chapel at the Paris Salon of 1824, depicted a group of white-clad knights kneeling in prayer in a shadowy Gothic interior, their mantles glowing in the candlelight like the wings of moths, their faces invisible, their hands clasped around the hilts of their swords, a vision of monastic militarism that combined the piety of the cloister with the menace of the barracks, and that set the visual template for the Templar imagery that would dominate the popular imagination for the next 2 centuries. The pre-Raphaelite painters in England, who were obsessed with the medieval and the chivalric, also took up the Templar theme, and the white mantle appears in several of their works as a garment of tragic purity, a cloth that the doomed knights wear with a melancholy grace that is a premonition of their coming destruction. The white mantle, in the history of art, has been a canvas on which the artists of each era have projected their own fantasies and their own anxieties, a cloth that has been painted by the painters as many times as it was woven by the weavers, and that has accumulated, in the course of its long visual history, a patina of meanings that is as thick and as rich as the patina of age on the stone of the Templar castles. The white wool that was once the uniform of the poor Knights of Christ has become, in the hands of the artists, a medium of the imagination, a surface on which the dreams and the nightmares of the West have been inscribed, a garment that is no longer a garment, but a symbol of a symbol, a sign of a sign, a ghost of a ghost that haunts the galleries and the museums and the screens of the modern world. A white shadow that is the last trace of the men who once wore the mantle and who are now, like the mantle itself, dissolved into the light and the air and the memory of a history that will not let them go. The white mantle's relationship to the history of textile technology is a dimension of the garment's significance that has been largely ignored by the historians of the Templar order, who have focused, understandably, on the military, the political, and the religious dimensions of the white wool, but the technology that produced the mantle is itself a part of the story. A part that connects the Templar uniform to the great currents of economic and technological change that were transforming the medieval world. The wool that was used for the Templar mantles was, as we have noted, the finest English wool, a commodity that was the foundation of the English economy in the Middle Ages and that was exported to the textile centers of Flanders and Italy, where it was woven into cloth that was traded throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The Templars, by purchasing this wool in such vast quantities, were participating in the creation of a globalized textile economy that was one of the most dynamic sectors of the medieval economy, a network of trade and production that connected the sheep pastures of the Cotswolds to the dye vats of Acre and the tailors' workshops of Jerusalem. The technology of the horizontal loom, which the Templars adopted in their eastern workshops, was itself a product of the technological exchanges that the Crusades had stimulated, an innovation that had been developed in the Islamic world and that allowed the production of wider and more consistent cloths than the older vertical looms that were still in use in most of Europe. The Templar workshops, by adopting this technology, were at the forefront of the medieval textile industry, and the mantles that they produced were, in their own time, state-of-the-art garments that embodied the most advanced weaving techniques available in the 12th and 13th centuries. The white mantle, in this technological perspective, was not merely a symbol of the past but a product of the future, a garment that was made possible by the very economic and technological forces that the Templars, as bankers and merchants as well as soldiers and monks, were helping to create. The irony of the Templar mantle, in this economic reading, is that the garment that was worn as a sign of the renunciation of the world was itself a product of the world's most advanced commercial and industrial systems, a piece of cloth that was woven by the invisible hands of the global economy, washed in the waters of international trade, and blessed by the prayers of the Church, a garment that united. In its white wool, the material and the spiritual, the economic and the sacred, the ancient and the modern, in a synthesis that was the distinctive achievement of the Templar order, and that was, in the end, the secret of its success and the cause of its destruction. The white mantle's capacity to inspire reverence and awe in the modern viewer, even after the passage of so many centuries and the loss of so much of the original context of the garment, is a phenomenon that deserves a moment of reflection as we approach the end of this long journey through the history of the Templar uniform. The white wool and the red cross, which once blazed on the battlefields of the Holy Land, have faded into the brown and the gray of the museum case and the archaeological fragment, but they have not lost their power to move us, to stir in us a sense of wonder, and of longing for a world that is gone and that will never return. The white mantle speaks to something deep in the human psyche, something that is older than the Crusades and older than Christianity, something that is connected to the universal human experience of clothing as a second skin, a garment that transforms the wearer and that marks him as a member of a community, a soldier of a cause, a servant of a god. The Templars understood this power, and they wielded it with a sophistication that was rare in the Middle Ages, creating a uniform that was at once a sign of humility and a badge of elite status, a garment of poverty and a cloth of immense value, a shroud for the dead and a banner for the living, a piece of wool that was, in the end, A work of art that was worn on the body and that transformed the body into a work of art in its turn. The white mantle is gone now, consumed by the flames and the centuries, but its ghost remains, a white shape at the edge of the vision, a rustle of wool in the silence of the archive, a splash of red on a field of white that is the afterimage of a dream that the medieval world dreamed and that we, the inheritors of that dream, are still trying to understand. The white mantle of the Templars is a garment that has become a myth that has become a memory that has become a hope, and the hope that it represents, the hope that a simple piece of cloth can carry the weight of the soul, that a uniform can be a sacrament, that a garment can be a gateway to the divine, is a hope that is as alive today as it was on the day when the first 9 knights knelt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and received from the hands of the Patriarch the white wool that would be their only possession and their only identity, their only comfort and their only glory, their only shield and their only shroud, the garment of the poor knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the white mantle of purity, the cloth that conquered the world and that was conquered by the world, the wool that was woven in time and that will be worn in eternity. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.